A strange woman disembarks from a train in the Montana wilderness in 1884. No family, no money, only a name and a letter promising her life. They say she's come to rob a wealthy widow. They say she won't survive the first winter. But no one, not a single person in that suspicious town, knows that this woman will change everything. Like to support the channel and comment the name of the city you're watching. I want to know how far this story has come. The stagecoach pulled into Harlan Creek just after noon, and Evelyn Mercer was the only passenger who stepped off alone. She had known it would look bad. A woman traveling without an escort, with a single trunk and a carpet bag that had seen better years, stepping onto a muddy main street in a territory where most people had learned to distrust anything they didn't recognize on sight. She had told herself on the 3-day train ride from St. Louis, and then again through the jolting misery of the stagecoach from Billings, that it didn't matter what strangers thought of her. She had made her decision. She was going to honor it. That conviction lasted about 40 seconds. By the time she had her footing on the plank sidewalk, 3 men standing outside the feed store had already stopped talking to watch her. A woman hanging laundry between 2 posts caught sight of her and leaned over to say something to a girl beside her. The girl stared. Didn't look away when Evelyn noticed. Just kept staring with the flat, assessing expression that children learn from their parents without being taught. Evelyn set her bag down, straightened her spine, and looked up the street. Harlan Creek was not what she had imagined. She didn't know exactly what she had imagined. Something smaller, probably. Something less permanent. Instead, the town had a hardware store, a land office, 2 saloons facing each other across the wide mud track of the main road, a church with a bell tower, a doctor's shingle hanging above a narrow doorway, and at the far end, a livery stable with a hand-lettered sign she couldn't read from this distance. There were people moving through it all with the brisk purposefulness of people who had things to do and no interest in slowing down for someone they didn't know. She picked her bag back up. The trunk could wait. The letter from Gideon Cross had given her the name of the general store as the place to wait if the ranch wagon hadn't arrived yet. She found it easily enough, Alderman's General Goods painted in faded green above a wide porch, and pushed through the door into the smell of tobacco, sawdust, and cured leather. A man behind the counter looked up. He was somewhere past 50, with a gray mustache and the careful eyes of someone who kept track of everything that moved through his establishment. "Help you?" "I'm waiting for someone from the Cross Ranch," Evelyn said. "Wagon was supposed to meet me." The man's expression didn't change exactly, but something shifted in it, a slight recalibration. "You'd be the one then," he said. She didn't ask what he meant by that. She already knew. "I'd be the one," she said pleasantly, and found herself a chair near the window. She waited 40 minutes. She used the time to watch the street because watching was something she had always been better at than most people realized. She watched the way men tipped their hats to certain women and not others. She watched a boy of about 12 trying to coax a stubborn mule out of a water trough and failing repeatedly. She watched a woman in a good dress, too good for a Tuesday afternoon in a frontier town, come out of the land office across the street with her face set in tight, unhappy lines and walk quickly toward the saloon on the left, then stop herself, turn, and go the other direction instead. Evelyn found herself wondering what that woman's story was. She was still wondering when the wagon arrived. She heard it before she saw it. The creak and rattle of a heavy rig, the particular sound of more than one horse pulling. When she looked out the window, a buckboard was pulling up with 2 big roans in the traces and a man on the seat who was not Gideon Cross. This man was younger, maybe 25, with a sun-darkened face and the loose, comfortable posture of someone who had been driving wagons since before he needed to shave. She gathered her bag and went out. "Miss Mercer?" the young man called down. "That's right." "Tom Briggs. I work the cross spread." He set the brake and climbed down, moving to the back of the wagon without ceremony. "Your trunk's being brought out?" "Still on the sidewalk by the stage stop." He nodded and went without being asked. She watched him hoist it like it weighed nothing and settle it into the wagon bed, and she thought, all right, at least someone here is efficient. The drive out to the ranch took the better part of 2 hours. Tom Briggs was not a talkative man, which she respected, though he answered her questions when she asked them. How far? What kind of terrain? How many hands did Cross run? Was the road always this rough? The answers were practical and short. The road was always this rough. The ranch ran 14 hands in summer, fewer in winter. The terrain between here and there was grass and rock and more grass. "What's he like?" she asked at one point. She had almost not asked. It felt like the kind of question that revealed too much, that she didn't already know, that she was nervous, that the dozen letters she'd exchanged with Gideon Cross over the past 5 months had still left her with a picture she wasn't certain was accurate. Tom was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone considering how to answer, but the silence of someone deciding how much to say. "He works hard," Tom finally said. "Fair with his men, not much for talking." "His children," Evelyn said. "He mentioned them in his letters. Clara and the boy, James." "Charlie," Tom said. "He wrote James. He probably wrote Charles. We call him Charlie." A pause. "Clara's 9. Charlie's 6. Their mama died 2 years back." Another pause, longer this time. "It's been a hard 2 years." Evelyn looked at the open land rolling out ahead of them, the enormous sky going pale gold toward the west, where the sun was starting its afternoon descent. She had known, in a general sense, what she was coming into. A widower with young children, a ranch that needed a woman's steadying presence, or so Gideon had written, though he'd put it more practically than that. He had put it very practically, in fact, and she had appreciated the honesty of it. He wasn't looking for romance. He was looking for someone capable who could help him raise his children and manage a household and not fall apart the first time a mountain lion got into the chicken coop. She had written back with equal practicality. She was 31, educated but not delicate, skilled at managing households because she'd been running her widowed father's home since she was 15, and she had no illusions about what frontier life involved. She had read enough to know. She had been wrong about several things, she suspected. She was almost certain of it now, watching the land open up around her. Cross Ranch came into view as they rounded a long slope. First the outbuildings, a cluster of barns and corrals and a bunkhouse, and then the main house, which was larger than she'd expected. 2 stories built from timber and stone, with a wide porch running along the front and smoke coming from the kitchen chimney. It sat on a rise above a creek that caught the afternoon light in bright pieces. It was, she thought with some surprise, genuinely beautiful. And then she saw the man standing on the porch, and the 2 small figures beside him, and the surprise of the house faded because the practical reality of the moment landed on her all at once. She was here. She had actually done this. Gideon Cross was taller than she'd pictured, dark-haired, going gray at the temples, with the kind of face that had been weathered by years of squinting into bright sky and cold wind. He was not smiling, but his expression was not unfriendly. He watched the wagon come up the drive with the same attentiveness Tom Briggs had shown, the look of someone who was assessing what was in front of him and keeping the assessment to himself for now. The girl Clara stood slightly behind him, one hand gripping the porch railing. Her face was guarded and very still. The boy, Charlie, was standing at the edge of the porch with an energy that suggested he had been told to stay there, but was finding it very difficult, and his eyes were wide with something that might have been curiosity, or might have been fear, or might have been both at once. Tom pulled the wagon up and set the brake. Nobody said anything for a moment. "Miss Mercer," Gideon Cross said. His voice was lower than she'd expected. "You made it." "I made it," she said, and climbed down before Tom could get around to help her. Not to make a point, just because she'd been looking after herself for a long time, and the instinct was automatic. She walked up to the porch steps and stopped. Up close, Gideon Cross looked tired in a way that wasn't just physical. There was something worn through about his eyes, like a place where the wood had been rubbed thin. She recognized it because she'd seen it in the mirror for a while after her father died. "Long trip," he said. "Long enough." She looked at the children. "Hello, Clara." "Hello, Charlie." Clara said nothing, just watched her with those careful, measuring eyes. Charlie said, "Your hair is red." He said it with the complete factual certainty of a 6-year-old who had made an important discovery. "It is," Evelyn agreed. "Papa's hair is black, mine's brown. Clara's is brown too." "Charlie," Gideon said quietly. "I'm just saying." Evelyn almost smiled. Almost. "Come inside," Gideon said. "Hattie's kept supper." The woman called Hattie turned out to be Harriet Bowes, who had cooked for the Cross household since before the children were born, and who made her position on the new arrangement clear within approximately 10 minutes of Evelyn walking through the door. Not with words, Hattie was too shrewd for that, but with the small, precise choreography of a woman demonstrating that she knew exactly where everything was and exactly how everything worked, and that any incoming female presence would need to earn its place before touching so much as a mixing bowl without permission. Evelyn understood immediately and kept her hands to herself and asked questions instead of offering opinions. It was the right call. By the end of supper, Hattie had thawed about 3 degrees, which Evelyn suspected was the equivalent of a standing ovation from a woman like that. The meal itself was difficult in the specific way that meals with strangers always were. The pauses just long enough to be uncomfortable, the conversation careful and surface level. Gideon asked about the train and the stagecoach. She answered. She asked about the ranch and the season. He answered. The children said almost nothing. Charlie stole glances at her repeatedly and then looked at his plate when she caught him. Clara ate with the focused deliberateness of a child who had decided to be invisible. After supper, Gideon showed her to a room on the second floor, clean, simply furnished, with a window that faced the creek. He stood in the doorway with one hand on the frame and said, "I want to be straight with you, Miss Mercer." "Please," she said. He considered that. The town's already talking. Word got around about the arrangement. Some people have opinions about it. I assumed they would. "I'm not a man who cares much what people say about me," he said. "But I want you to know what you're walking into. There are families in this valley who've been out here longer than I have, and they have a certain view of things. A woman coming out here under these circumstances—" He paused, searching for the word. "Looks opportunistic," Evelyn supplied. He met her eyes. "Some would say." "And what do you say, Mr. Cross?" He was quiet for a moment. "I say I wrote you a letter that was honest about what I needed and what I could offer, and you wrote back the same way. What either of us does with that is between us." He pushed off the doorframe. "We'll talk more in the morning. Sleep if you can." He left. She listened to his footsteps going down the hall, then the creak of the stairs. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the floor for a while. Outside, the Montana night was enormous and very dark, and she could hear the creek somewhere below the window, moving fast over rocks. She was not sorry she had come. She was not sure yet whether that was wisdom or stubbornness, but she was not sorry. The morning came cold and brilliant, frost on the grass and the sky a hard, clean blue that seemed to have no ceiling. Evelyn was up before the children and found the kitchen already occupied by Hattie, who glanced at her, then at the coffee on the stove, and said nothing, which Evelyn interpreted as permission. She poured a cup and stood by the window while Hattie moved around her with the efficiency of a woman who had spent 40 years making herself indispensable. "Ranch hands eat at 6, Hattie said, without preamble. "They eat in the bunkhouse, not here. Mr. Cross eats here with the children. I cook. You can set the table if you want something to do." "Thank you," Evelyn said. She set the table. Gideon came in at 5:50, already dressed and smelling of horses and cold air. He looked mildly surprised to see her up, then unsurprised, then just sat down and accepted coffee. Charlie appeared shortly after, still half asleep, hair going in 4 directions. Clara came last, fully dressed and combed, looking as though she had been awake for an hour already. They ate, eggs and biscuits and dried apple slices. Gideon talked briefly about the day's work. Something about a section of fence on the north pasture, and a report from one of his hands about cattle drifting toward the Pendleton property line. He didn't address any of it to Evelyn specifically, but he didn't exclude her from the conversation either. It was simply the morning accounting of a man who ran a ranch and had a lot to keep track of. After breakfast, Clara helped Hattie clear and wash. Charlie followed Gideon out toward the barns. Evelyn stood in the kitchen with her second cup of coffee and thought about what to do next. This was the part no letter had prepared her for. The actual specific texture of a day she didn't belong to yet. She went outside. The ranch yard was busy in the morning light, hands moving between the barns, horses being led to the water trough, someone hammering something rhythmic and steady in the direction of the equipment shed. The air smelled like hay and manure and the sharp mineral smell of the frost burning off the grass. She walked to the fence at the edge of the yard and looked out across the range. It went on for a long time. She had grown up in cities, St. Louis, then Cincinnati for 2 years, when her father had worked there. Then back to St. Louis. She knew how to navigate a city. She understood its rhythms and its rules. This was something else entirely. "You're going to need boots." She turned. A man was leaning against the fence post about 10 feet away, hat pushed back, watching her with an expression that was not quite amusement, but was not particularly respectful either. He was maybe 40, wide through the shoulders, with a handlebar mustache, and the look of a man who considered himself the authority in any room he was standing in. "I have boots," she said. He looked pointedly at her feet. She was wearing her traveling boots, leather, reasonable heel, not designed for mud or rough terrain. "Those aren't boots," he said. "Those are shoes with ambitions." He pushed off the post. "Roy Caswell. I run the hands." "Evelyn Mercer." "Yeah, I know." He looked at her steadily. "You know how to ride?" "I've ridden." "Horses?" She kept her expression neutral. "Horses? Yes." He grunted, which could have meant anything. "Mr. Cross wants someone to go out with the fence crew today. Check the north line. You could observe if you're serious about learning the operation." She recognized the offer for what it was, partly genuine, partly a test she hadn't been asked if she wanted to take. She thought about what Gideon had said the night before, about what she was walking into. She thought about Hattie's careful choreography, and Clara's still, watchful face, and the way the men at the feed store in Harlan Creek had watched her get off the stagecoach. "What time does the crew leave?" she asked. Caswell's mustache moved. "Half hour." "I'll be ready," she said. "Cheshbash betum." She was ready in 20 minutes, having changed into her one pair of practical clothes, a dark wool skirt, heavier blouse, and her oldest boots, which were not ideal, but were better than what Caswell had dismissed. When she came out to the yard, 2 hands were already mounted, and a third was tightening cinches on a sorrel horse that Tom Briggs, standing nearby, quietly indicated was hers for the day. "She's even tempered," Tom said. "Name's Biscuit." "Biscuit," Evelyn said. "Don't let the name fool you. She can move." She mounted without difficulty. Caswell watched from his own horse and said nothing, which she took as grudging acceptance. They rode out north through the pale morning, 4 of them. Herself, Caswell, Tom, and a young hand named Pete, who looked barely old enough to be earning wages, through grass still silver with frost, and past a stand of aspen that rattled their leaves in the light wind. The fence line ran along a ridge, and when they reached it, the view opened up to the east in a way that stopped her breath for a moment. Rangeland rolling away for miles, the distant dark line of mountains, the enormous sky going gold where the sun was still climbing. She had not expected to be moved by this. She had been pragmatic about the whole thing, deliberately pragmatic, because sentiment had gotten her into trouble before. But this landscape was something she hadn't factored in. "Section's down here," Caswell said, and they moved along the fence until they found it. 200 feet of posts leaning or broken, wire down in the grass, the work of a bad windstorm, or maybe something heavier coming through. The hands dismounted and started assessing without needing to be told. Evelyn dismounted and held Biscuit's reins and looked at the damage. "What takes down a fence section like this?" she asked. Not to anyone in particular. "Could be wind," Pete offered. He was young enough to still answer questions sincerely. "Could be cattle pushed through. Could be something else." Something else meaning what? Pete glanced at Caswell. Caswell kept his eyes on the downed wire. "Meaning sometimes things fall down because someone helped them fall," he said. Evelyn looked at the fence again. She was not a rancher. She didn't know what deliberate damage looked like versus weather damage. But she filed the answer away and watched the men work, and asked enough questions to seem engaged without being irritating, which was a line she had learned to walk years ago. On the ride back, Caswell pulled his horse alongside hers and rode in silence for a while before speaking. "You're not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" He thought about it. "City woman trying to turn herself into something she's not." "That's still possible," Evelyn said. "You've known me 4 hours." He almost smiled. "Not quite." "Fair," he said, and let his horse fall back. "Unchad." The first week passed in layers of exhaustion and education. She learned the names of the hands, Tom, Pete, 2 brothers named Holt and Dell, an older man called Sutter, who said almost nothing but could fix anything mechanical, and 3 others who came and went between the home ranch and the summer pasture. She learned the rhythms of the house, when Hattie wanted the kitchen empty and when help was acceptable, how Clara set the table and what order she did it in, which floorboards in the second-floor hallway creaked, and at what hour Gideon came in from the range. She learned that Charlie had a particular horror of spiders, but would not admit this under any circumstances, and that Clara read for an hour every night before sleeping, working through a shelf of books that had belonged to her mother. She and Gideon spoke every evening after supper, sometimes briefly, sometimes for longer. He was not an easy man to know. He answered questions directly, but didn't volunteer much, and the space around his silences was complicated. Not cold exactly, but defended. She understood defended. She had worn it herself long enough to recognize the shape of it. "The children aren't warming up," she said one evening, maybe 10 days in. Not accusingly, just stating the situation. Gideon was quiet for a moment. They were on the porch, the evening settling in around them, the first real chill of autumn in the air. "Clara was 6 when her mother got sick," he said. "She watched it for 2 years. She's 9 now, and she knows exactly how things can change." He looked at his hands. "Charlie was too young to remember much. He doesn't know what he's supposed to feel." "And you?" she said. "Do you know what you're supposed to feel?" He looked at her then, straight at her, the way he rarely did. "No," he said. Then, "Do you?" She considered it. "I feel like someone trying to find the edges of a room in the dark," she said, cautious, not sure what I'm going to run into. He nodded slowly, like that was a satisfactory answer, maybe because it was honest. He said, "The trouble came from outside, and it came the way trouble usually did, gradually and then all at once. The first sign was the wire, a second fence section down, on the east pasture this time, in a place that had no reason to fail. The posts were sound, the wire was new." Caswell walked the break 3 times and came back with his jaw set. "Someone cut it," he told Gideon, flat and certain. The second sign was the grain. 20-pound sacks of oats stored in the near barn, found split open and scattered across the floor, not knocked over but cut along the seam and spread deliberately. An hour's work. Done sometime in the night, because Sutter checked the barn at dusk and found nothing. Gideon said very little about either of these things in Evelyn's presence. He said them quietly to Caswell and Tom, and she overheard because she was becoming fluent in the ranch's rhythms, and she knew when something was wrong by the way the men stood. But he didn't hide it from her either. When she asked directly, he told her. "Who would do this?" she asked. "I have thoughts," Gideon said. "Not proof." She waited. "There are 3 ranchers in this valley who've been here longer than I have," he said. "Pemberton and his 2 sons run the biggest spread to the north. Aldous Fletcher has land to the west, Earl Driscoll to the south." He looked out the window at the range. "Pemberton and I have had differences before. Nothing serious. But he was one of the loudest voices when my father sold this land and I inherited it. Thought the land should have been offered to established families first. And now there's me," Evelyn said. Gideon looked at her. "Now there's you, an outsider who some people already see as a threat to the way things have been. Do they know I'm not exactly sitting on a fortune of my own?" The corner of his mouth moved, almost a smile. "They know. Doesn't matter. The idea of you is the threat." She thought about this for a long moment. "What do you want to do?" "Keep my eyes open," he said. "Stay patient. Not give anyone cause to say I'm acting without evidence." "And if it continues?" He was quiet. "Then patience runs out," he said, and that was all. But 10. The town of Harlan Creek made its feelings clearer when Evelyn went in with Tom for supplies the following Saturday. She had been once before, briefly, the week of her arrival. This time she went into the dry goods store, the butcher, and the post office, and in all 3 places she encountered the particular social form of a community closing ranks. Conversations that stopped a beat too late, the exact degree of politeness that meant nothing, and then, in the dry goods store, something more direct. The woman from the land office, the one Evelyn had watched from the general store window on her first day, the one in the too-good dress, was there. Her name turned out to be Margaret Haverford, wife of the man who ran the land office. She was 40 or so, handsome in a sharp-edged way, and she came up to Evelyn with the direct confidence of a woman who had decided something. "You're Miss Mercer," she said, "the cross woman." Mrs. Cross, technically, Evelyn said carefully. They had married by proxy before she traveled, which was not uncommon, but which she knew read as strange to people who didn't understand the practicalities of arranging such things across distance. Though that's putting it more formally than the situation warrants, for now. I heard about the arrangement, Mrs. Haverford said, with a tone that made arrangement sound like a disease. We all did. I imagine so. I want you to understand, Mrs. Haverford said, keeping her voice low but making no attempt at privacy. Two women nearby were very obviously listening. That in this community we look after our own. Gideon Cross has been our neighbor for 8 years. His wife, God rest her, was a woman who built relationships here over years. Trust that was earned. She paused. There are people who think the best thing for his children would be a woman who already understands this place, this life. I'm sure there are, Evelyn said. She kept her voice even and her hand still on the counter in front of her. What I'm saying, Miss Mercer, Mrs. Cross. A beat. What I'm saying, Mrs. Haverford continued, is that there are people who will be watching, and people who will be waiting for you to give them reason to be concerned. Evelyn looked at her for a moment, at the carefully neutral faces of the women pretending not to listen, at the shopkeeper behind the counter who had developed a profound interest in his inventory. Mrs. Haverford, she said pleasantly, I've been watched and waited on my whole life. I'm fairly good at being observed. She picked up her list and turned back to the counter. Thank you for the warning. On the wagon ride back, Tom said nothing for a long time. Then, that went about the way I expected. About, Evelyn agreed. She's not the worst of them, Tom said. Just the most organized. Evelyn looked at the road ahead. Good to know. What she hadn't anticipated, couldn't have anticipated from letters alone, was how quickly the children would become the thing she thought about most. Not because they were difficult, though they were. Clara in particular had a gift for making someone feel invisible without being openly rude, which was an advanced social skill for a 9-year-old and suggested she had been watching adults do it for years. Charlie was easier in temperament, but more volatile. He could be laughing one minute and furiously tearful the next over things that seemed to adult eyes not to warrant either, but they were also, in their different ways, remarkable. Clara was reading at a level that surprised Evelyn when she finally saw what the books were. Not simple stories, but history, geography, natural science, a battered copy of Shakespeare's histories that she'd apparently been working through for months. When Evelyn mentioned it, Clara looked at her with an expression that suggested she'd been expecting the observation to come with a diminishment of some kind. A comment about whether Shakespeare was appropriate or whether she should be reading something more suitable. Instead, Evelyn said, "Which one are you on?" Henry V, Clara said carefully. Do you like it? A pause. I like the parts where he's not sure he's right, Clara said, the night before the battle, when he walks around and talks to the soldiers and doesn't tell them who he is. Evelyn looked at her. Because he's testing them, or because he wants to be seen without the armor. Clara blinked. Then, so small she almost missed it. Both. Yeah, Evelyn said. Me too. It wasn't a breakthrough. It was a sentence. But it was more than they'd managed in 2 weeks, and she held on to it quietly, the way you held on to something fragile in both hands. Charlie's thing was animals, not just the horses and cattle, which were facts of life on the ranch, but the small creatures. He came to her one morning with a sparrow he'd found that had hit the barn window and was stunned and sitting in the grass. He held it in his cupped hands with an expression of such concentrated anxiety that she felt something catch in her chest. It's not dead, he told her, urgently. No, it's not. But it's not flying. Sometimes they need a minute, she said. She showed him how to keep it warm without squeezing, how to put it somewhere safe. A shallow box, a corner of the porch, out of the wind, and let it come back to itself on its own terms. He sat beside the box for 2 hours. When the bird finally lifted off from the porch rail, he made no sound at all, just watched it go with his face very open and unguarded, the way children's faces are before they learn to protect themselves. He was back to being 6 again after that, loud and distractible and impossible to keep at a table. But for those 2 hours on the porch, he had been someone else, someone quieter and more serious and entirely unself-conscious about caring deeply about something small. She thought about that for a long time afterward. 3 weeks into her time at Cross Ranch, on a Tuesday evening when the sky was going amber and purple to the west, Gideon Cross came in from the range an hour later than usual. She could tell by the way he moved that something had happened. She didn't ask right away. She put food in front of him and let the children tell him about their day and waited until Charlie had been put to bed and Clara had gone upstairs with her book. "What happened?" she said. He set his coffee cup down. "Driscoll. His foreman came out to our south fence line today and told 2 of my hands that the fence was going to come down whether we took it down or not, that the land on the south pasture belongs to Driscoll's water rights, and we've been building into his territory." "Is that true?" "No," Gideon said. "I have the survey. The fence is 6 feet inside my own property line." "What does he want?" Gideon was quiet for a moment. "I think he wants a fight," he said. "Not necessarily about the fence." "About me," Evelyn said. He didn't answer directly, which was its own answer. "The surveyor I used when I bought this land is in Billings. I'm going to write to him for a copy of the original documentation." "And in the meantime?" "In the meantime, the fence stays where it is." She nodded, looked at her own coffee. "Gideon." He looked at her. "I'm not going to be the reason this ranch suffers," she said. "If my being here is genuinely making things worse, stop," he said. Not harshly, firmly. She waited. "The fence trouble started before you arrived," he said. "The grain in the barn. That happened the second week you were here, but the feeling behind it didn't start then. This valley has been working itself up to something for longer than that." He paused. "You're a convenient focus. That's different from being the cause." She thought about that. "You believe that." "I know it," he said. She looked at him. The tired lines of his face in the lamplight, the gray at his temples, the hands wrapped around the coffee cup. A man who had been holding something together alone for 2 years and was only beginning, maybe, to admit that he was tired of it. "All right," she said. "All right," he agreed. Neither of them said anything else for a while. Outside, the ranch settled into night around them, and the creek moved over its stones in the dark. And somewhere in the distance, something, a coyote probably, called once and was answered, and then the silence came back in full. She was still not sorry she had come, but she was beginning to understand in a way she hadn't before exactly what Stain was going to ask of her. The cold got serious in October, not gradually, the way fall moved in the cities Evelyn had known. A slow cooling, leaves changing color over weeks, the temperature dropping in polite increments. Out here it came in hard and fast, a front moving down from Canada that turned the air sharp overnight and left ice on the water trough 2 mornings running before anyone had quite prepared for it. The hands worked faster. Gideon rode longer hours. The pace of the ranch shifted into something more urgent, and Evelyn shifted with it, because there was no other option, and because she had decided, somewhere in the 3rd week, that the only thing worse than being useless was pretending she wasn't. She started earlier. She was in the kitchen before Hattie most mornings, which initially earned her a look of such precise irritation that she almost backed out. But she didn't touch anything that was Hattie's, didn't rearrange, didn't offer suggestions, just started the fire in the stove and had the coffee ready and set the breakfast table before the older woman came down. And after 4 days of this, Hattie stopped giving her the look and started telling her where things were kept. It was the closest thing to an invitation Evelyn expected to get, and she accepted it without making a fuss. The days had a shape now. Mornings in the kitchen and then out into the yard, learning by watching and then by doing. Slowly, with plenty of failures that she cataloged privately and adjusted for. She had ridden out twice more with the fence crew, and her seat in the saddle had improved enough that Pete, the young hand, had stopped watching her with visible anxiety every time Biscuit moved faster than a walk. Caswell still assessed her with those careful eyes whenever she did something new, but the assessment had shifted in character. Less skepticism, more the look of a man revising a calculation. She made mistakes. She knew she was making them even as she made them, which was somehow worse. Her instincts were city instincts, and they led her wrong in ways that the hands were too polite to laugh at directly, though she caught the grins they aimed at the middle distance. She tried to move a horse that didn't want to move the way she would have moved a person who didn't want to move, with reasoning and gentle pressure. and Biscuit demonstrated in about 3 seconds that this was not how horses worked. She tried to help with a calf that had gotten tangled in brush without thinking about the mother, and the mother made her feelings known with enough force that Tom had to step in front of her. She tried to fix a section of fence using the wrong kind of splice, and it held for about 20 minutes before coming apart, and she had to go back and redo it while Pete very carefully looked somewhere else. But she learned. She learned because she paid attention, and because she asked questions, and because she was genuinely not too proud to be wrong, which turned out to be a quality that ranch hands respected more than most things she might have offered instead. What she hadn't expected was that learning the land would teach her something about the people in it. The valley had a logic to it that she started to understand only once she stopped trying to map city thinking onto frontier geography. Out here, everything was about water and winter, and how much of either could kill you. The ranchers who'd been here longest had built their positions around the things that couldn't be moved. The creek systems, the mountain passes, the grazing land that stayed green into fall while the higher slopes went brown. Pemberton, whose spread lay north and who Gideon had mentioned as the loudest voice against outsiders, controlled 3 creek tributaries. Driscoll to the south sat on the main access road into the valley from the South Pass. Fletcher to the west had the timber rights on the ridgeline. Individually, these were advantages. Together, and she had begun to suspect that together was the point, they formed something closer to a stranglehold. She raised this with Gideon one night, carefully, when the children were in bed and the lamp was low, and he was going over the ranch accounts with the focused unhappiness of a man doing math he already knew he didn't like. "Pemberton, Driscoll, and Fletcher," she said. "Are they close?" He looked up. "What do you mean close?" "Friendly. Do they socialize? Do their families know each other?" He put his pencil down. "Pemberton's oldest boy is married to Driscoll's niece," he said slowly. "Fletcher and Pemberton go back 20 years before either of them had land out here." He paused. "Why?" "Because the things that have been happening to this ranch," she said, "don't feel like one man's work. The fence wire, the grain, Driscoll's foreman showing up at your south line. These feel like pieces of something." Gideon was quiet for a moment. The lamp flame moved in a draft from somewhere. "That's a serious accusation," he said. "I'm not accusing. I'm noticing." She folded her hands on the table. "If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. But I'd rather say it out loud and be wrong than keep quiet and be right." He looked at her for a long time. Not the way he looked at most things, with that careful, neutral assessment, but with something slightly less defended. "Tom said something similar," he finally said. "Last week. He's been out here longer than any of my other hands, knew this valley before I bought the ranch. He thinks there's an arrangement. An arrangement to do what? To make me sell," Gideon said flatly. "The crossland sits in the middle of the valley. Whoever controls it controls the water flow from the northern tributaries all the way to the South Pass access. My father bought it before anyone understood how valuable that position was going to be." He closed the account book. "They've been patient, that's what Tom says. But patience runs out." She thought about this, about the careful, organized quality of Mrs. Haverford's warning in the dry goods store, about the fence sections that came down in places where the wire was new, about the grain split along clean, straight seams. "What did your father do when someone came after him?" she asked. Gideon looked at her. "Fought back," he said. "Directly. He was not a subtle man." A pause. "It nearly cost him the ranch twice." "And you?" "I'm trying something different," he said. "I'm trying to be smart about it." He picked up his pencil again. "Some days I'm less sure that's right." "Smart doesn't mean passive," she said. He looked at her again. Then he went back to his accounts, but the line of his shoulders had changed slightly. Something had settled in them. She didn't push it further. The thing with Clara happened on a Thursday, in the barn, and it came out of nowhere the way the most important things usually do. Evelyn had been repairing a harness, one of the simpler tasks she'd gotten competent at, the stitching and conditioning of leather, which was detailed work she could do sitting down and which had the advantage of being genuinely useful without requiring her to be on a horse or in the way of men doing heavier jobs. She hadn't noticed Clara come in. The girl moved quietly as a habit, and the barn had enough ambient noise, horses shifting, the wind in the roof, that a 9-year-old could be invisible in it. She only knew Clara was there when the girl said, quietly but clearly, My mother used to do that. Evelyn looked up. Clara was standing about 8 feet away, holding her school primer to her chest, watching the harness work with an expression that was entirely unguarded for once. The careful, neutral face completely gone, something raw and young in its place. Evelyn didn't say anything immediately. She kept her hand still on the leather. "The stitching?" she said after a moment. She said it was meditative, Clara said. The word was precise and slightly too old for her, the word of a child who had learned language from adults. She said you had to stop thinking about other things to do it right. She was right about that, Evelyn said. She set the harness down on the hay bale beside her. "Do you want to try it?" Clara looked at the harness, then at her. The open expression had started to close back up. Evelyn could see it happening, the slow reassembly of the neutral face, the return to wariness. "You don't have to," Evelyn said. "I was just asking." "I know how," Clara said, a little stiffly. "She taught me." "Then you know more than I did when I started," Evelyn said. She meant it simply, without strategy. Clara was watching her like she was waiting for the catch, Rassin, the line where the kindness turned into something else. "Do you miss her?" Clara said suddenly. The question came out harder than she probably meant it to, blunt and a little fierce, the way grief came out of children when it had nowhere else to go. Evelyn held very still. "I never met her," she said carefully. "I can't miss her the way you do." "That's not what I asked." She considered that. "Are you asking if I feel bad about being here, in her place?" Clara said nothing, but she didn't look away. "Yes," Evelyn said honestly. "Sometimes, not because I think I'm wrong to be here, but because I know it's not simple, and I know I can't be what she was to you." She paused. "I'm not trying to be." "Then what are you trying to be?" Clara said. The question had some anger in it, but also something else. Something that sounded, under the anger, like a real question. Evelyn thought about Henry V walking through his camp the night before the battle, wanting to be seen without the armor. "Useful," she said. "Honest. Someone you can trust not to disappear on you." She picked the harness back up. "That's about as far as I've gotten." Clara stood there for another moment. Then she walked over and sat down on the hay bale on the other side of the harness, opened her primer, and read. She didn't pick up the stitching, but she stayed. The sabotage escalated in the second week of October, and it escalated in a way that stopped being merely expensive and became genuinely dangerous. It started with the livestock. 20 head of cattle from the west pasture were found scattered across a 2-mile stretch at dawn. Not strayed, but driven, pushed through a gap in the fence line that hadn't been a gap the night before. Getting them back took most of the day, and 2 hands who should have been doing other things. The gap in the fence was clean, deliberate, and in a place so far from the main road that someone had ridden out specifically to make it. Then the water trough near the main barn was fouled. Something dumped in it overnight that made the horses refuse to drink. Sutter found it in the morning before any animals took sick from it, which was luck, or close enough to it. He drained and cleaned it without comment, but his face when he came to report to Gideon was the face of a man who was getting tired of staying calm. The third thing was the most pointed. A ranch hand, Dell, the younger of the Holt brothers, came back from a supply run into Harlan Creek with a message. Not written, but delivered verbally by a man he didn't know who had stopped him outside the feed store. The message was simple. The Cross Ranch was going to keep having problems until problems became easier to escape by selling and leaving. Dell reported this to Gideon with the flat, careful tone of a man reading from a paper he hadn't written and didn't endorse. Gideon listened without expression. When Dell finished, he said, "Thank you, Dell," and Dell went back to work, and Gideon stood in the yard for a while looking at nothing in particular. Evelyn had been at the edge of the yard when Dell came in. She'd heard most of it. She waited until Dell was gone before she came to stand near Gideon, not beside him, a foot or two to the side, giving him room to have his thoughts without her in the middle of them. "This is going to get worse before it gets better," she said. "Yes." "What are you thinking?" He didn't answer right away. "I'm thinking that I can ride out to Pemberton's place tomorrow and have a direct conversation," he said. "And I'm thinking that will accomplish nothing except giving him information about how bothered I am." He paused. "And I'm thinking that my father would have already gone and I'm still standing here." "Your father almost lost the ranch twice," she said. I know. His voice was quiet and not entirely settled. There's a difference between being direct and being reactive, she said. Pemberton wants you reactive. He's built this to make you do something first. Gideon looked at her. What would you do? The question surprised her. Not because it was unexpected from him exactly, but because it was asked without any of the subtle guarding that usually ran underneath his sentences. It was a straight question, from a man who genuinely wanted to know. She thought about it seriously before answering. I'd go into town, she said. Not to Pemberton. Into Harlan Creek. I'd talk to people, the ones who aren't connected to Pemberton's circle. The ones who might be tired of the way things run in this valley. I'd find out who's actually behind this before I moved. You think it's not Pemberton directly? I think a man as careful as Pemberton doesn't send his own people to deliver verbal threats to ranch hands outside feed stores, she said. That's sloppy, and nothing else he's done has been sloppy. She paused. I think someone else is doing the ground level work, someone with less patience and less to lose. Gideon was quiet for a long moment. Driscoll's foreman, he said. That's my guess, she said, but guessing's not knowing. He nodded slowly. Then he looked at her with that straight, considering look she had come to recognize, the look of a man who was revising something he'd previously decided. I've been keeping you out of the business side of this, he said. Not apologetically, just acknowledging it. I know, she said. That was wrong of me. She said nothing because he wasn't finished. You see things I don't see, he said. Different angles, things I'm too close to. He paused again. I'd like you to come with me. Into town. We'll do it your way. She looked at him. Something in her chest had gone steady and careful, the way it did when she was trying not to show she'd been moved by something. All right, she said. Bob. They went in on a Saturday, which was the day most people came in from the ranches for supplies and errand and the particular frontier form of socializing that happened in the spaces between. Evelyn had been thinking about who to talk to since Thursday, running through what she'd observed and what she knew. She had been watching Margaret Haverford. It had taken her a few weeks to understand what she'd seen on that first day. The woman coming out of the land office with that tight, unhappy face, turning toward the saloon and then stopping herself. She'd put it together slowly, the way you put things together when you didn't have all the pieces, but the shape was starting to be visible. Haverford's husband ran the land office. The land office held the surveys and the property records and the water rights documentation for the entire valley. And Margaret Haverford, who had come to warn Evelyn off in the dry goods store with the rehearsed precision of someone who had been asked to do it, had a face when she wasn't performing that looked like a woman carrying something heavy. Evelyn went to the dry goods store first, because that was where she was expected to go, and she bought what was on the list and talked to the storekeeper about the weather and the price of grain futures, and she was pleasant to the two women who were there and said nothing that anyone could use. And then she walked down the street to the small restaurant that operated out of the back of what was nominally a hotel, 4 rooms above a kitchen that served food to anyone who had the dollar for it, and she sat down and ordered coffee. Margaret Haverford came in 20 minutes later. Evelyn hadn't orchestrated this exactly, but she had walked past the land office on the way and seen the light on and the door slightly open, and she had calculated, correctly as it turned out, that Margaret Haverford came to the restaurant on Saturdays when her husband was working. The woman stopped when she saw Evelyn. A moment of calculation crossed her face. Evelyn gestured at the chair across from her. Mrs. Haverford, please sit. The coffee's good. It was a test. The kind of test where either answer was revealing. Margaret Haverford sat down. For a while they talked about nothing. The weather, the coming winter, the state of the South Road after the last rain. Evelyn let it breathe. She had learned, watching Gideon, that silence was not a thing to be filled immediately, that sometimes what people were trying not to say was more useful than what they said. I owe you an apology, Margaret Haverford said, eventually, into a quiet moment between them. Her voice was lower than it had been in the dry goods store. The performance quality was gone from it. What I said to you when you first came in, I was asked to say it. Evelyn waited. George, my husband, he was asked by Pemberton to make clear to you that your presence here was not welcome. George couldn't do it himself without it looking like official pressure, so I was to do it socially. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. I'm not proud of it. I want you to know that. I didn't think you were acting entirely on your own, Evelyn said. Margaret looked at her. You're perceptive. Sometimes. What does Pemberton want with the crossland? A silence. Margaret was deciding something. The water rights, she said. There's a tributary that runs through the northern edge of your east pasture. If the Cross Ranch sold and the land were acquired by Pemberton, which is what would happen, George has seen the offer that's been prepared, the tributary would connect to the two Pemberton already controls and give him essentially complete water dominance of the northern valley. She paused. It would also mean the south road access that Driscoll controls would have to negotiate with Pemberton for grazing passage, which gives Pemberton leverage over Driscoll as well. So Driscoll isn't in this with Pemberton, Evelyn said. Driscoll thinks he is, Margaret said quietly. Pemberton has made him believe they're cooperating. But George has seen the secondary documents. If Cross sells and Pemberton gets the land, Driscoll loses his advantage entirely. She looked at her coffee. My husband hasn't said anything because he's afraid. Pemberton has been generous to us in ways that make saying things complicated. Evelyn sat with this for a moment. The shape of it was coming clear now. The part she'd suspected and the part she hadn't known connecting up into something that was both simpler and uglier than she'd imagined. Pemberton was not working with Driscoll. He was using Driscoll. Is there documentation? She said. The secondary documents. Anything your husband could provide officially. He won't, Margaret said. I know him. He won't. But you could tell me what's in them. Margaret looked at her for a long, uncomfortable moment. Why would I do that? Because you sat down, Evelyn said simply, and because you apologized, and because you have the face of someone who's tired of being on the wrong side of something. The restaurant was nearly empty around them. Outside, the Saturday traffic of Harlan Creek moved past the windows in the gray October light. The offer that's been prepared for Gideon, Margaret said finally, the one that will be presented once the pressure becomes sufficient. It significantly undervalues the water rights on the east tributary. It's been prepared assuming Gideon doesn't know what those rights are worth. She paused. But a competing survey, done by an independent assessor from outside this valley, would establish the actual value. And if Driscoll were made to understand that Pemberton's plan ends his South Road advantage, she stopped. Driscoll would stop cooperating, Evelyn said. Pemberton's pressure depends on having enough neighbors willing to make things difficult, Margaret said. Without Driscoll, he doesn't have enough. Evelyn looked at her. You've thought about this quite a bit. I think about a great many things that I don't say out loud, Margaret Haverford said quietly. There was something in her voice that was not quite bitterness and not quite resignation, something in between, the feeling of a woman who had been making herself smaller for long enough that she'd almost forgotten she knew how to take up space. I was a school teacher before I came here, she said. I used to believe I was the sort of person who stood up for things. Evelyn held her gaze. You're standing up right now, she said. Something moved in Margaret Haverford's face. Small and complicated and real. Gideon was at the hardware store when she found him. She took him by the arm and steered him to the back of the building, past the bins of nails and coils of wire, to a quiet corner where she talked for about 5 minutes. And he listened without interrupting, which she had come to understand was the way he absorbed things that mattered. When she finished, he stood there for a moment. The East Tributary, he said. He doesn't know you know what it's worth. I didn't know what it was worth, Gideon said, with a slight dry quality that wasn't quite humor. I knew it was there. Get your own survey done, she said. Independent, from outside the valley. And Driscoll? I think you ride to Driscoll directly. Not as an enemy, as a neighbor who has information he might want. He's been participating in making our life difficult for 2 months. I know, she said. But men do things they wouldn't do if they had better information. And Pemberton's been controlling the information in this valley for years. She paused. Driscoll doesn't benefit from your ranch failing. He only thinks he does. Gideon looked at her. The hardware store smelled of iron and oil and dry wood. You went in there to find this out, he said. I went in there for coffee, she said. He looked at her for another moment. Then, for the first time since she'd arrived in Montana, Gideon Cross did something that surprised her completely. He laughed. It was short and not loud, but it was real. The laugh of a man who had been holding himself very tightly and had just, for a moment, let go. "For coffee," he said. "The coffee was good too," she said. He shook his head, still with something like that laugh in his face. Then it faded, and he was serious again, but differently serious than before. There was something lighter in the seriousness, like a door in a dark room that had been opened a crack and was letting in air. "I'll write to the surveyor in Billings this week," he said, "and I'll ride to Driscoll." "Take Tom," she said. "Not Caswell. Caswell will make it look like a confrontation." He nodded. He had already thought of that, she could tell, but he nodded like it was a useful confirmation. Yeah, the visit to Driscoll happened on a Tuesday, and Gideon came back from it with the slightly stunned expression of a man who had gone to a fight and arrived to find the other person had already been punched by someone else. He was already angry, Gideon told her that evening. Not at me, at Pemberton. Something happened. I don't know what, Driscoll didn't say exactly, but something happened last week that made him suspicious about what Pemberton's actual plan was. He was cold when I arrived and listening by the time I left. Did he commit to anything? He said he'd pull his foreman back, Gideon said. He said what happens next winter to the South Road access is his own business, and not Pemberton's. He paused. He didn't apologize. He's not that kind of man. He doesn't have to apologize, Evelyn said. He just has to stop. He'll stop, Gideon said. I believe him on that. He looked at her. The surveyor from Billings is coming out next week, and Margaret Haverford's husband, he came to see me this afternoon. Came out to the ranch himself. He brought a copy of the secondary documents Margaret told you about. Evelyn went still. He changed his mind. I think his wife changed it for him, Gideon said. She sat with that for a moment. George Haverford, who had been afraid. Margaret Haverford, who had been a school teacher and believed in standing up for things, and had been making herself smaller for years. One conversation over coffee on a Saturday. Good, she said quietly. Gideon was watching her with that look again, the less defended one. You knew she'd talk to him, he said. I thought she might, Evelyn said. I wasn't sure. You went in on a guess. Most things worth doing start as guesses, she said. He was quiet for a moment. The evening was settling in around the house, the lamps lit, the sound of Charlie's voice from upstairs asking Hattie something with great urgency about what was for supper. Evelyn, Gideon said. She looked at him. I owe you an apology, he said, for the first weeks, for treating you like a household problem to be managed rather than someone with sense. You treated me fairly, she said. I was cautious when I should have been open, he said. There's a difference. She thought about Clara, saying, That's not what I asked. The girl had her father's directness and none of his guarding, or not yet. And watching them together, Evelyn had begun to understand where Gideon's defended quality had come from. Not from personality, but from grief. From 2 years of being the only person between two small children and a world that didn't stop demanding things from them. All right, she said. Apology accepted. Just like that? Was there more you wanted to say? He considered. No, he said. I think that was it. Then just like that, she said. The survey came back with numbers that made Gideon go quiet for a long time when he read them. These tributary water rights were worth nearly 3 times what Pemberton's prepared offer had valued them at. With the documentation in hand and Driscoll no longer cooperating, the organized pressure on the Cross Ranch began, not to collapse exactly, because Pemberton was too methodical for that, but to go quiet. The incident stopped, the fence lines held. But something else happened in those weeks that was harder to name and more important in the long run. Charlie started meeting Evelyn at the porch steps after supper. Not deliberately. He would have denied it was deliberate with absolute conviction. But she began to notice that if she went out to sit in the evening air, he would appear within 10 minutes with his various treasures. A rock with an interesting stripe, a feather he'd found, a caterpillar in a jar. He talked about these things with the focused intensity of a 6-year-old who had found an audience willing to take him seriously. And she did take him seriously because his observations were often more accurate than his age suggested. Do you think the caterpillar knows it's going to change, he asked one evening. What do you mean? Like, does it know what's coming? Or does it just go into the cocoon and then it's a butterfly and it doesn't remember being the other thing? She thought about this. I don't think it knows, she said. I think it just does what it has to do. Charlie was quiet for a moment, looking at the jar. I think that's okay, he said finally. I think it's okay to not know and do it anyway. She looked at him. 6 years old, with brown hair that needed cutting and mud on his boots at all hours, saying things that she would remember for a long time. Yeah, she said. I think so too. Clara, for her part, had not repeated the barn conversation and did not bring it up again. But something had shifted in the architecture of the girl's behavior. Small things, easy to miss. She started putting a second cup on the table when she saw Evelyn coming in from outside. She started acknowledging her in the mornings, not warmly, but consistently. A nod, sometimes a word about the weather or something she'd read. Once, and only once so far, she had asked Evelyn's opinion about something in the Henry V, a line she couldn't parse, in the night before the battle scene where the king asked for ceremony to make him think he was different from other men. Evelyn had sat down with her and they'd read it together for 20 minutes, and when she'd looked up at the end, Clara had the careful, shuttered face on, but underneath it, just barely visible, was the look of a child who had gotten something she needed. She didn't push it. She went back to whatever she'd been doing, but she kept the moment the way she kept all of them. The sparrow in the box, the harness in the barn, the coffee in the restaurant on Saturday, carefully and without making too much of them, because the ranch was still in the middle of something. Pemberton had gone quiet but not away, and quiet men with patience and resources were not the same as defeated men. The winter was coming in hard. The work was endless and the days were short, and there were mornings when she woke before dawn in the cold room above the creek and felt the full weight of where she was and what she'd walked into and what it was still costing her, in ways she hadn't counted on when she'd written that first practical letter to a man she'd never met. But she got up. She lit the lamp and went downstairs and started the fire in the stove and had the coffee ready. Every morning she got up and started the fire. That was not a small thing. She was beginning to understand that it might be the only thing that mattered. The surveyor from Billings left on a Friday morning, and by Friday afternoon the news that he had been at Cross Ranch was already in Harlan Creek. Evelyn didn't find this out directly. She found it out the way she found out most things in this valley, sideways, through the texture of small shifts. Tom came back from an errand into town that evening with a particular set to his jaw that she had learned to read, and when she asked him what was in the air, he told her that 2 men she didn't know by name but recognized by description, Pemberton's men, had been asking around the feed store about whether anyone had seen a surveyor's equipment coming or going from the Cross property. They know, she told Gideon. They were going to know eventually, he said. The question is what they do with knowing. What Pemberton did, it turned out, was wait, which was worse. The waiting had a quality to it that was different from the earlier quiet. The earlier quiet, after Driscoll had pulled his foreman back, had felt like a held breath. Something paused. This new quiet felt like something gathering. Caswell felt it too. She could see it in the way he kept his eyes moving when he was in the yard, and in the way he started stationing hands at the outer fence lines in pairs instead of alone, without being asked to and without explaining why. Sutter, who remained the least communicative person on the property, started locking the near barn at night. These were not things anyone discussed. They were just things that started happening, the way the ranch had shifted into faster rhythms when the cold came. Adjustment without announcement. November arrived with the week of gray skies and wind that came in low from the northwest and cut through every layer. The mountains to the west disappeared behind cloud for days at a time, and the creek ran high and dark from the rain that was snow higher up. The children were kept inside more, which meant the house was louder, and the contained energy of 2 young people with nowhere to burn it off created its own kind of pressure. Hattie managed this with the iron competence she brought to everything, but even Hattie's patience had visible edges by the 4th day. Evelyn started teaching Clara in the afternoons, not formally. There was a school in Harlan Creek that Clara attended when the weather and the roads allowed, but November was making both uncertain, just working through whatever Clara was reading and following the threads that came out of it. The Henry V had given way to a history of the American West that Evelyn had found on the bottom shelf of the sitting room bookcase, and Clara read it with the same focused hunger she brought to everything she cared about, stopping every few pages to ask questions that were almost always better than the book deserved. "It says the railroad changed everything," Clara said one afternoon, looking up from a chapter. "But changed it for who?" Evelyn was mending a shirt across the table. What do you mean? It says changed everything like it's just a fact. Like there was a before and after, but it changed things differently for different people. She looked at the page with the slightly combative expression she wore when something wasn't satisfying her. The people who already lived here, it changed everything for them too, but not the same way. That's true, Evelyn said. So why doesn't the book say that? Because the person who wrote the book was thinking about one kind of people, Evelyn said. It's a thing that happens. You write what you can see from where you're standing. She paused. The useful thing is to notice when you're only getting one view. Clara looked at her. Is that what you were doing when you went to talk to Mrs. Haverford? Evelyn went still for a moment. She wasn't sure what Clara had overheard or pieced together. The girl was quiet and observant enough that she probably knew more about the ranch's affairs than anyone had given her credit for. Something like that, she said carefully. Papa said you figured out something he hadn't seen, Clara said. The tone was factual, not accusatory, just noting. Your father sees things I don't see, Evelyn said. We see different things. That's not a flaw in either of us. Clara considered this. Then she went back to the book, and Evelyn went back to the mending, and the wind moved around the house, and the lamp burned steadily against the gray afternoon. Charlie, meanwhile, had developed the conviction that the cats in the barn were conducting some kind of organized society that he alone was privy to, and he provided daily intelligence reports on their activities with complete seriousness. There were 3 of them, a gray tom, a tortoiseshell female, and a young orange cat that had arrived on the property in September without explanation and been accepted into the household on the basis that no one had gotten around to turning it away. Charlie had named them General, Mrs. Hudson, and Biscuit Jr., the last because of what he considered a strong personality resemblance to the horse. Evelyn spent more time than she would have expected listening to reports about the internal politics of this feline arrangement, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she didn't mind. It was in these weeks, the gray cold weeks of early November with the mountains hidden and the ranch working at a slower, interior pace, that something between her and Gideon changed in the way that changes happened in their relationship. Gradually, without announcement, and only recognizable for what it was after it had already become something. He started telling her things, not information about the ranch's problems, though that too, but other things. He told her about the first winter he'd spent on the property after his father died, how the cold had been worse than anything he'd anticipated, and 2 of his hands had quit in January, and he'd spent 3 weeks doing the work of 5 men and sleeping 4 hours a night. He told her about the summer his wife was first sick before they knew what it was, how she had been so determined to pretend it was nothing that he had almost let himself believe her, and how not letting himself believe her had been one of the hardest things he'd ever done. He told her about Clara at 6, how even then the girl had this quality of watching the world with a measuring eye, as if she were keeping score on something. He told her these things in the evenings, on the porch, or at the kitchen table after the children were in bed, in the rambling, not quite organized way of a person who had been keeping things to themselves for a long time and found, once they started letting things out, that there was more stored up than they'd realized. She listened and didn't perform sympathy, didn't make the noises people made when they wanted you to know they were feeling sorry for you. She just listened, and sometimes asked a question, and sometimes said something that wasn't comfort but was honest. He seemed to want honest more than comfort. She understood that. She told him things too. Her father, a good man with a talent for debt, who had loved her sincerely and relied on her completely, and left her, when he died, with no money and no immediate prospects, and a skill set that consisted mostly of managing a household and knowing how to stretch a dollar until it was nearly transparent. The year in Cincinnati, which had been a mistake she'd recognized about 6 weeks in and spent the next 18 months correcting. The first letter she'd sent to the agency that handled mail-order arrangements, the weird, specific shame of writing it, the way she'd had to talk herself through her own resistance by pointing out that most marriages were arrangements of some kind, and at least this one was honest about it up front. Were you frightened? Gideon asked. When you were on the train, coming out here. She considered lying, not seriously. She wasn't a person who lied when a truthful answer was available, but she considered it for a moment, the way you considered whether to wear a coat before deciding you needed it. Yes, she said. Not the way you'd expect. I wasn't frightened about the place or the work. I was frightened that I'd get here and find out I'd made the whole picture up in my head. That the letters weren't that you weren't, what? Real, she said. I was frightened you'd be real but different. That the person who wrote those letters and the person at the end of the trip would be two different people. He was quiet for a moment. And you were the same, she said. That was the thing that surprised me. You were exactly who you'd said you were. He looked at the middle distance in the way he had. I thought the same about you, he said after a moment. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The storm that changed everything built for 3 days before it broke. Tom saw it coming first. He'd grown up in Montana and had the natives' relationship with weather. Not prediction exactly, but a physical awareness of atmospheric pressure that manifested as a kind of unease, a tendency to look at the sky at odd moments and not like what he found. He mentioned it on a Wednesday. By Thursday morning, the clouds to the northwest had taken on the dark-bellied look of something serious, and by Thursday afternoon, the temperature had dropped 8 degrees in 4 hours, and the wind was coming in gusts that rattled the outbuildings. Gideon had 30 head of cattle in the high north pasture. He'd planned to bring them down earlier in the week, but one of the horses had come up lame and the crew had been stretched across 3 different problems at once, and the north pasture had been the thing that got deferred. By Thursday evening, it was clear this had been a mistake. We can get up there before it breaks, Tom said. They were in the barn, Gideon and Tom and Caswell and Evelyn, looking at the horses. Outside, the wind had a sound in it now. Not gusting, but sustained, a low continuous pressure that made the barn walls creak. How long before it breaks? Gideon said. Tom looked at the ceiling, like he was listening to something no one else could hear. Tonight, he said. Could be early morning, could be midnight. Not later than midnight. How many can we take? 4 horses, 4 riders, Caswell said. Get up there, push them down the north trail before the snow hits. Trail's rough, but manageable if we move. The creek crossing on the north trail, Tom said. It's running high. How high? Tom looked at him. High enough to matter if it gets worse. Gideon was quiet for a moment, the calculation moving behind his eyes. 30 head of cattle in a high pasture with a major storm incoming versus a creek crossing that was already risky and was going to get worse as the rain and snowmelt came down the mountain. We have to go, he said. We leave half of them up there. We lose half of them. I'm coming, Evelyn said. Everyone looked at her. Caswell's face said no before his mouth did. Miss Mercer, he started. Mrs. Cross, she said, not harshly. And 4 riders is 4 riders. Who else are you taking if I don't come? Caswell looked at Gideon. Gideon looked at Evelyn. Can you handle the North Trail in this weather? He said. I don't know, she said honestly, but I can handle Biscuit, and I won't panic, and I'll do what you tell me. That's what you need. A beat. Gideon looked at Tom. She rides all right, Tom said, which from Tom was a significant endorsement. Get your coat, Gideon said. She went. The North Trail climbed through timber and then above it, into open rocky country where the wind hit without anything to interrupt it. They rode in single file, Tom at the front, then Gideon, then Evelyn, then Caswell behind her like a rear guard, and the temperature dropped with every 100 feet they climbed. The rain started before they reached the high pasture, not yet snow, but cold enough that it was trying to be, hitting exposed skin like small, sharp things. Evelyn kept her eyes on Gideon's back and Biscuit's ears. Biscuit was unhappy with the weather and let her know it in the coiled, sideways way of a horse that didn't like what it was walking into, but trusted its rider enough not to refuse entirely. She talked to her quietly, the way Tom had shown her. Not commands, just sound, just presence. And Biscuit moved forward. The cattle were where they should be, bunched up in the low corner of the high pasture against the eastern fence line, which was what cattle did when weather came. They found a corner and waited. 32 head, not 30. Someone had miscounted earlier. The extra 2 were a cow and a calf that had gotten separated from the main group and were standing about 200 yards away, the calf pressed against its mother's side. We'll push them together first, Tom said, raising his voice against the wind. Get the pair in with the main group, then move everyone together down the trail. This sounded straightforward. It was not straightforward. Moving cattle in bad weather was a particular kind of work that Evelyn had observed twice and helped with once, under conditions that were nothing like this. The wind was making the horses nervous, and the nervous horses were making the cattle nervous, and the nervous cattle were making everything worse. The main group kept breaking and regrouping in the wrong direction, and Caswell was swearing with steady professional creativity, and Tom was working the outer edge on his horse with the quiet economy of a man who had done this in worse conditions but was not pretending these weren't bad. Gideon rode like he was part of the horse. She had watched him work cattle before, but never in conditions like this, and the difference was visible. The way he and his horse moved as one piece of machinery, anticipating the cattle's movement before it happened, cutting off breaks before they developed. He didn't shout. He barely used his heels. He just knew where the cattle were going before they did, and he was there. It took 40 minutes to get the pair in with the main group. By the time they had 32 head pointed in the right direction and moving toward the trailhead, the rain had gotten serious, and the light was going wrong in the way light went wrong when a real storm was close. That flat grayness with no shadows that meant the sky had closed. "Creek's going to be up," Tom said, pulling alongside Gideon. "I know. We can hold them up in the timber stand at the halfway point. Wait it out." Gideon looked at the sky. "How long would we wait?" "Till morning at least. We'd lose them to cold before morning." He shook his head. "We cross." They started down. The north trail in good weather was tight. Narrow track through timber with the grade dropping steeply in places. Room for the cattle, but not much margin. In rain and failing light, with 32 agitated animals and 4 riders trying to keep them together, it was a controlled chaos that required everyone to be in the right place at the right time, with no room for error. Evelyn stayed to the left. Where Tom had positioned her before they started down, her job was to keep the cattle from pushing off the trail into the timber on that side, which they kept trying to do because the timber was out of the wind. She pushed. She blocked. She used her voice the way she'd been told. Biscuit found the work once they were moving. The horse had cattle instincts that were better than her riders, and there were moments when Evelyn simply let Biscuit decide and held on and trusted. They heard the creak before they saw it. It was loud in a way it hadn't been, a different sound from the usual fast running over rocks, lower pitched and more continuous, the sound of a lot of water moving fast and heavy. When they came out of the timber at the crossing point, Evelyn saw it and felt something cold in her stomach that was not from the rain. The crossing, on her previous rides this way, had been a rocky ford maybe 15 feet across, knee-deep on a horse in the fall flow. What was in front of them now was 40 feet of brown, fast-moving water with debris moving in it. Branches, a section of fence rail, things she couldn't identify. The bank on this side was already being undercut. The water had come up fast from the storm on the mountain that was still an hour or more away down here. "We can't cross that," Caswell said. He said it flatly, with no drama, which made it worse. Tom was looking at the crossing with the expression of a man running through options. "There's no other trail down that doesn't add 3 hours. 3 hours in this is the same as no hours," Gideon said. "The upper crossing," Tom said. "Quarter-mile up from here. It's narrower, but the banks are higher. It might not be up as far." "Might," Caswell said. "I know." Gideon looked at the cattle, which were bunching at the creek edge, confused and frightened by the sound and the water. 3 had already tried to turn back the way they'd come. If the herd broke here, on this narrow trail with the timber on both sides and the creek in front, getting them back together in the dark would be nearly impossible. "Upper crossing," he said. "Move." They pushed the cattle back up the trail and along the ridge to the upper crossing, and the upper crossing was better. Narrower, higher banks, maybe 30 feet of water, but not good. The water was still moving fast and brown and high, and when Tom rode his horse in to test the depth, the horse went shoulder deep in the middle and came out blowing and shaking. "It's crossable," Tom said, dripping. "Barely." "How do we get the cattle through that?" Caswell said. "Same way we get cattle through anything," Gideon said. "First one in brings the rest." He looked at his horse, then at the water. "I'll take the lead." "Gideon," Tom started. "I'll take the lead," Gideon said again, and started his horse in. What happened next happened fast and in pieces that Evelyn's brain filed separately and only reassembled afterward. Gideon's horse crossed to the middle of the channel where the water was deepest and fastest, and the horse went deep, deeper than Tom's had, and something shifted under its feet, a section of the creek bed giving way in the flood-loosened gravel, and the horse stumbled. Gideon stayed in the saddle, which was the skill of a man who had been riding since before he could read, but the stumble sent the horse sideways in the current instead of forward, and the current was stronger than it looked from the bank. And in the 3 seconds before the horse found its feet again, they had moved downstream 8 feet, and the horse was fighting to get purchase on a bottom that was moving. The horse got its feet, but Gideon's left leg in those few seconds had been against a submerged boulder, and when the horse lurched back upright and he got it turned toward the bank, she could see from the way he held himself that something was wrong. He made the near bank, but his face when he came up out of the water was a color that wasn't right. He dismounted on the bank and took 2 steps and went down on one knee. Evelyn was off Biscuit before she'd decided to dismount. She was at his side when she realized she didn't know how bad it was. "Where?" she said. "Left leg." He was breathing through his teeth. "Not broken. I don't think it's broken. Jammed against the rock." He looked up at her. Rain was coming hard now, the leading edge of the storm visible as a dark wall on the mountain above them. "Get the cattle across." Tom and Caswell can't do it alone. There aren't enough riders. He started trying to stand. She put her shoulder under his arm and helped him up. He was heavy, and the ground was slippery, and she nearly went down with him. "Can you stand on it?" she said. "Well enough." He wasn't steady, but he was upright. "There's no time, Evelyn. The water's still rising. We have to move all of them in the next 20 minutes, or we lose the crossing entirely." She looked at the water, at the cattle huddled at the bank, 32 animals that represented most of the winter's income, at Tom and Caswell on the far side, watching her and Gideon. She thought about what she knew. She'd been watching cattle work for 2 months. She'd helped push cattle twice. She was not a drover. She was not Tom or Caswell or Gideon, but she could think. "The cattle won't cross on their own," she said. "Not in that. They'll need to see another animal cross first." "That's what the lead rider is for," Gideon said. "Not a horse," she said. "A cow." She turned and looked at the herd. At the back of the group was the cow and calf pair from the high pasture, the 2 that had been separated from the main group. The cow was one of the older animals. She'd seen her on previous rides, recognized her by the notched ear. "Her calf is on this bank," Evelyn said. "If the calf crosses—" "You can't get a calf to cross that water voluntarily," Caswell called from the far bank. "I don't need it to cross voluntarily," Evelyn said, and she handed Biscuit's reins to Gideon and went to the back of the herd. She had watched Tom work cattle. She had watched the way a skilled drover moved around an animal, the way pressure was applied and released, the angles that meant something to a cow's nervous system. She was not skilled. She had never done this specific thing, but she understood the principle. She got behind the calf, small enough that she could have picked it up if she'd been willing to try, which she was not. And she applied pressure from behind, slow and steady, no sudden moves, talking the whole time in the low, continuous voice that Tom used. The calf moved toward the water. Its mother immediately followed, because that was what mothers did. "Start pushing the herd toward the bank," she called to Gideon. "Evelyn, push them toward the bank." She heard him start moving, and she heard the cattle shifting, and she focused everything on the calf, which was now at the water's edge and did not want to go further. She pressed closer, giving it no room to turn, and the calf went in. The water took it sideways immediately. The calf bawled, a high, startled sound, and the mother went in behind it without hesitation, and what happened next was the thing she had been counting on. The mother was a strong cow, and she got her head around and her shoulder under the calf and drove it across with the absolute flat determination of an animal that was not going to lose her young. And the current was bad, but not bad enough. And they came out on the far bank in about 40 seconds. The rest of the cattle, who had watched this, who had seen 2 animals go in and come out on the far side, who were being pushed from behind by one injured man doing more than he should have been on a leg that was hurting him, moved toward the water. Not willingly, not without stopping and starting and one large steer that turned and had to be cut off. But they moved. Evelyn got back to Biscuit and mounted, because the crossing was going to need everyone on horseback to manage, and she rode into the water. It was bad. The cold of it was a shock even through her boots, and the current pulled with a sideways force that wanted to take her offline. And there was a moment in the middle where she felt Biscuit's feet searching for solid bottom and not finding it for 2 full strides. And in those 2 strides she understood, in the full body way of someone who is not thinking, but just existing. exactly how fast something could go wrong out here. Biscuit found bottom, came out on the far bank. She was shaking when she dismounted. Not visibly, she didn't think, but inside, in the bones. She turned back and watched. Gideon crossed last. His horse was deliberate and careful in the water, a different animal from the stumble earlier, as if it too understood that this was the final crossing and there was no margin left. He came out on the far bank and didn't get off his horse because getting off and back on with that leg in this cold was something to do only once more. His face was still not the right color. "The calf," Caswell said, looking at her. He had an expression she hadn't seen from him before. "Her mother would follow," Evelyn said. "I just needed them in the water." "How did you know the herd would follow the cow?" "Tom explained it to me," she said. "First animal in set's the example. I couldn't send a horse in first again." Tom was looking at her too. Not the way he usually looked at her, appraising, measuring, but something else. She didn't have a word for it and didn't spend time looking for one because behind them the storm arrived. It arrived the way Tom had said it would, fully and without warning, the rain turning to mixed sleet in about 90 seconds and the temperature dropping hard. The wind coming in from the north with enough force that the cattle balled together again and stopped moving. Getting them down the rest of the trail in this took another hour that felt like 3, and by the end of it, everyone was soaked through and Gideon's face had gone from wrong-colored to something she found genuinely frightening, and she stayed close to him on the trail without making it obvious that she was doing it. They got the cattle into the south pasture, which was lower and sheltered, with windbreak timber to the west. They got the horses into the barn. Hattie, who had apparently been watching from the window for some time, had dry clothes and hot water ready without being asked. In the kitchen, later, with the storm loud against the windows and the children, who had been woken by the noise and installed in the sitting room with a lamp and strict instructions not to move, Evelyn sat on a stool while Hattie looked at Gideon's leg, and the older woman's expression told her what she needed to know about the severity before the doctor's morning visit would confirm it. "Deep bruising," Hattie said, in the tone of someone who had seen worse but wasn't dismissing this. "Possible cracked bone above the ankle. He needs to be off it." "I'm right here," Gideon said. "I know you are," Hattie said, unmoved. Evelyn looked at him. He looked back at her with the particular expression of a man who had been through something hard and was not quite ready to sort out what he felt about it. "You did a stupid thing," she said quietly. "I know. Going in first like that." "I know," he said again. There was no defense in it. He was too tired for defense. "Don't do it again," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "The cattle," he started, "are in the south pasture," she said. "All 32. He looked at her for a long time. The kitchen was warm and the storm was outside and the lamp was doing what lamps did in storms, which was make the inside feel more inside. His face, finally, was returning to its correct color. "Evelyn," he said. He opened his mouth, closed it, seemed to be deciding something. "Thank you," he said finally. Just that. But the way he said it had more in it than the words. She nodded. She didn't make anything of it, because she was tired and wet, and the inside of her was still running a little fast from the creek crossing. She accepted Hattie's dry blanket and wrapped it around her shoulders, and drank the coffee that appeared in front of her and listened to the storm do its work against the house. From the sitting room, she could hear Charlie's voice, the pitched, urgent sound of a child who had too many questions and not enough answers, and Clara's voice under it, quieter, doing the thing that Clara did, which was supply calm when someone else was panicking. Managing. The girl managed everything she could reach, like her father, Evelyn thought, and like whoever her mother had been, probably. She thought about the creek, the calf going in and the mother following and the herd, against everything sensible choosing to cross. She thought about what Caswell had said. How did you know? She hadn't known. She'd made the best calculation she could with the information she had, and the knowledge Tom had given her, and the 20 seconds she'd had to think. She'd been wrong about things before. She could easily have been wrong about that, but she hadn't been. The cattle were in the south pasture. Tom came into the kitchen for coffee and stood near the stove with the steam rising off his clothes, and he looked at her once and he said, "Good thinking," and went back out. For Tom, that was a speech. Caswell didn't say anything that night, But the next morning, when she came out to the yard and started toward the barn, he was there before her, and he had Biscuit out and was checking the horse's feet after the crossing, and he said, without looking up, "She threw a shoe on the far bank. I'll get it sorted." He had never, in 2 months, done anything for Biscuit without being asked. She didn't make anything of that either. She just said, "Thank you, Roy," and went on into the barn. Outside, the storm had blown through in the night and left the world clean and cold and very quiet. The mountains sharp against the sky for the first time in weeks. The snow on the high slopes brilliant in the early light. The creek she could hear was still running fast, but it was lower. The worst of it had passed. For now, the worst of it had passed. What Pemberton would do with what he now knew, that the survey was done, that the documents were in Gideon's hands, that the Cross Ranch had just come through something that would have broken a less stubborn operation, that was still out there, patient and waiting. But that was tomorrow's problem. This morning, the cattle were alive, and so were all 4 riders, and Gideon's leg was not broken. And somewhere in the sitting room, Clara was explaining to Charlie with great seriousness exactly why the storm had happened and what it meant about mountain weather systems. And Charlie was arguing with her methodology, but listening to every word. Evelyn picked up a pitchfork and started on the hay. The doctor came out from Harlan Creek the morning after the storm and confirmed what Hattie had already said. Deep bruising, 1 small crack in the bone above the ankle, nothing that required setting, but everything that required staying off it. He wrapped the leg with the efficiency of a man who had wrapped a great many frontier injuries and had stopped offering sympathy along with the bandaging because sympathy didn't speed healing, and he had other calls to make. 6 weeks minimum, he told Gideon. 3, Gideon said. The doctor looked at him. 6, or you'll make it permanent. He packed his bag. Your wife will tell you the same thing. He said it without thinking. Your wife. The way people said things that had quietly become true without anyone marking the exact moment of the change. Evelyn was standing in the doorway, and she felt the word land differently than it had in the first weeks, when it had still felt like a description of an arrangement rather than a description of her. She didn't examine that too closely. She had enough to think about. Gideon was a bad patient in the specific way of men who had never allowed themselves to be still. He lasted 4 days of genuine rest before the restlessness became something Hattie described, with great precision, as a hazard to the household. He couldn't ride. He could walk, with the leg wrapped tight, and a stick he used when he thought no one was watching, and put aside when he thought someone was. He moved through the house and yard in a controlled frustration that had nowhere clean to go, and the hands gave him slightly more space than usual, and the children adapted by bringing their activities closer to wherever he was sitting so he didn't feel excluded from things. Charlie was particularly good at this, in the unconscious way of a 6-year-old who solved problems without theorizing about them. He simply started conducting his animal investigations in whatever room his father occupied, providing running commentary that required no response, and asked nothing of a man who didn't have much to give at the moment. Gideon listened. Sometimes he answered. Once, on the 5th day, Evelyn came into the sitting room and found them both asleep. Gideon in the chair with his leg up, Charlie on the floor beside him with his head on a folded blanket and his jar of caterpillar evidence tipped sideways next to his hand. She stood in the doorway for a moment and then went away without waking either of them. What the forced stillness did, practically, was put the ranch's daily decisions more squarely on Caswell and Tom, and increasingly on Evelyn. Not by design. Gideon was not the kind of man who delegated easily, but by necessity. He couldn't be everywhere, and the ranch didn't stop needing to be run because he was injured. She started taking the morning reports that Caswell had previously brought directly to Gideon, relaying them and returning with answers, and then, after a week of this, Caswell started coming to her with questions that he'd worked out himself and just wanted confirmed, and then, after another few days, simply coming to her with problems expecting solutions, which was a different thing entirely. You know he sees that, Gideon said to her one evening. He was talking about Caswell. Sees what? That you're running things. I'm relaying, she said. He gave her a look that said he knew the difference. He wouldn't take orders from someone he didn't respect, Gideon said. Caswell's been on this ranch 6 years. He didn't take direction from my wife easily, and she was here when he arrived. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. I don't give him orders, she said. I just answer the ones he's already answered himself. Gideon was quiet too for a moment. That's a skill, he said. It's just listening, she said. but she knew what he meant. The news about the storm's damage came in pieces over the following week, and the picture it assembled was worse than what had happened on the Crossland alone. The same front that had sent Evelyn and the others up the North Trail had come down the whole valley with equal indifference, and the creek system, swollen from the mountain snowmelt, had topped its banks in two places that flooded low-lying pastures. Fletcher's western fence line had come down in a half-mile stretch. Driscoll had lost part of a hay storage structure. Roof collapsed under the ice load, and two smaller operations north of Harlan Creek, families who had been in the valley for less time than any of the established ranchers had taken serious damage to their livestock shelters and lost animals they couldn't afford to lose. Tom brought this information back from town, where it was being discussed with the mixture of practical concern and careful neighbor watching that characterized how this valley processed bad news. Evelyn sat with it for a day. Then she went to Gideon. He was at the kitchen table, going through the accounts he could manage from a chair, his legs stretched out and the stick leaned against the wall where he put it when he wanted to pretend it wasn't there. "I want to ride out," she said. He looked up. To Fletcher first, then the Harlow family north of town. Tom says they're the worst hit. Their hay shed is gone and they have no secondary structure. She had thought about how to say this and decided the direct way was the only way. "I want to take 2 of our hands and some of our timber supplies. Help with the rebuild." Gideon studied her. "We're not exactly flush on supplies right now." "I know what we have," she said. "I checked with Sutter this morning. We have enough to spare without compromising the home buildings." "Fletcher," he said. "Why Fletcher?" "Because Fletcher is part of Pemberton's arrangement, and he's going to need help, and he's going to be too proud to ask for it," she said. "And because if we help him, we change what the arrangement is." Gideon was still studying her. "You want to dismantle Pemberton's coalition by being generous to the people in it." "I want to help neighbors who had a hard storm," she said. "What happens after that is up to them." He looked at the table, at the accounts. "Pemberton will see it as a move." "Pemberton sees everything as a move," she said. "That doesn't mean it is one, and it doesn't mean we shouldn't do it because he'll think that." A silence. Outside, the wind had dropped for the first time in days, and the morning was almost still. "Take Tom," Gideon said. "Take Pete and Dell. And Sutter. He'll be more useful than any of them if there's structural work involved." "And Caswell?" she said. "Caswell stays here. He runs the home ranch while you're out." He paused. "And Evelyn?" She waited. "Take the wagon," he said. Not just the timber. Take what we have in the root cellar. We're not going to eat all of it." She looked at him. Something in her chest did the quiet, careful thing it did when he surprised her. "That's generous," she said. "It's practical," he said, but the way he said it wasn't entirely convincing, and she thought he knew that. She went to Fletcher's first because it was closer, and because she wanted to understand the man before she arrived at the harder conversation of the families who had lost everything. Aldous Fletcher was 60-something, with the gnarled, deliberate quality of a man who had been outdoors his entire adult life and had the body to prove it. He met the wagon at the gate of his property with an expression that was suspicious in the way of a man trying to figure out what was being sold to him. "Mrs. Cross," he said. He'd never called her that before. When they'd crossed paths in town, he'd used her first name with the particular familiarity of someone who didn't intend it as warmth. "Mr. Fletcher, Tom tells me your west fence came down in the storm. We're handling it." She looked past him at the fence line, where she could see 2 men working slowly through what was clearly 3 days of accumulated repair. "We have timber in the wagon," she said. "And Sutter. He's fast and he doesn't waste materials." She looked back at Fletcher. "We have enough to spare. You don't have to handle it alone." Fletcher was quiet for a moment that was longer than comfortable. He was working through something. She could see it in his face, the adjustment of a man who had prepared for one kind of conversation and was being offered another. "Why?" he said. Not aggressively, actually asking. "Because the storm didn't ask whose fence it was before it came down," she said. He looked at her for another long moment. Then he looked at Tom and the hands in the wagon and at the timber. "My men will work alongside yours," he said. "I'm not taking charity." "I'm not offering it," she said. "I'm offering to work faster together than apart." He stepped back from the gate. "Drive in," he said. They spent the better part of the day at Fletcher's. and by the time they were loading the wagon to leave, 160 feet of fence line was standing that hadn't been that morning. Fletcher said almost nothing to Evelyn directly for most of the day, but toward the end, when Sutter was showing one of his men a technique for setting posts in frozen ground, Fletcher came to stand near her. "I want to tell you something," he said. She waited. "The arrangement with Pemberton, what we were asked to do about your operation." He stopped, started again. "I didn't know about the water rights survey issue, what George Haverford had in those secondary documents." He looked at the fence line. "I knew Pemberton wanted the land. I didn't know what he was planning to do with Driscoll once he had it." "I know," Evelyn said. "I'm not—" He stopped again. The word sorry was clearly difficult for a man like Fletcher, navigating in its direction, but not arriving. "I'm not proud of how I handled the early part of this," he said. "All right," she said. "That's it?" "What else do you want me to say, Mr. Fletcher?" she said genuinely. "I'm not interested in keeping score. I'm interested in whether we can be decent neighbors from here on." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read, something between respect and unsettlement, like a man who had walked into a room and found it arranged differently than he remembered. "I expect we can," he said. She nodded and went to get the wagon. Chem. The Harlow family was harder. Daniel and Ruth Harlow had come to the valley 3 years ago from Ohio, part of the second wave of settlement that had arrived after the first decade of ranchers had established themselves. They had 120 acres on the north end of the valley, a modest operation by the standards of the established families, and they had lost their hay storage structure completely. Roof caved in, 2 walls down, 8 of their cattle dead from exposure before morning because the shelter they'd moved them into for the storm had failed. Ruth Harlow was 34 and had the face of someone who had been keeping it together by force of will for 4 days and was close to the end of that particular resource. She came out when the wagon pulled up, saw Evelyn, and her face did something complicated. "We don't need—" she started. "I know," Evelyn said. She climbed down. "I'm not here because you need rescuing. I'm here because we had timber and supplies we could spare, and it made sense to bring them." Ruth Harlow looked at the wagon, at Sutter and Pete and Dell, at the provisions in the back, the root cellar stores, 2 sides of cured meat, grain bags. "This is too much," she said. Her voice was careful, the voice of a woman protecting her pride. "It's what we brought," Evelyn said simply. "Where do you want the timber?" There was a silence in which Ruth Harlow decided something. "Northeast corner," she said. "That's where the new structure goes." They worked 2 full days at the Harlow place. The second day, Daniel Harlow, who had said almost nothing on the first day, a quiet man with raw-boned hands who seemed to be processing something large and slow, came to work alongside Sutter, and by afternoon they were talking about structure and load and the angle of the roof in the easy shorthand of men who spoke the same practical language. On the second evening, Ruth Harlow cooked for all of them. It was a simple meal, beans and bread and dried apple, but she put it on the table with the particular care of a woman doing the only thing she had available to offer, and they ate it with the same care. After the hands had gone to the barn and the children, the Harlows had 3, all under 10, were in bed, Ruth sat across the table from Evelyn with coffee and said, "I heard about the creek crossing, the storm." "Word travels," Evelyn said. "Fast, when it's worth telling." Ruth turned her cup in her hands. "They say you got the cattle across by yourself." 3 other riders, Evelyn said, one of them injured. "He wasn't useless." Ruth looked at her. "I'm trying to say something." "I know," Evelyn said. "I'm making it difficult." Ruth almost smiled. "People in this valley said things about you," she said, "when you first arrived. I didn't join in, but I didn't disagree either, which is its own kind of thing." "It is," Evelyn agreed. "I'm sorry for that part," Ruth said. "Direct and simple." Evelyn nodded. "I appreciate that." "Daniel wants to know," Ruth said, "if Cross Ranch would consider a labor-sharing arrangement for the spring. We can't pay in cash, but we have skills. He was a carpenter in Ohio before this, and I can preserve and I can teach." "I'll talk to Gideon," Evelyn said. "But yes, I think yes." Ruth Harlow looked at her with the expression of a woman who had been holding herself very tight for several days and had just found a place to put some of the weight down. "Good," she said. "That's good." The ride back to Cross Ranch on the second evening was long and cold, and Evelyn sat in the front of the wagon with Tom and did not talk much, which Tom accommodated without comment. She was tired in the way that went below the physical, the kind of tired that came from being present and useful and careful for multiple days straight without the privacy to stop performing any of it. "You did good out there," Tom said, about halfway back. He said it the way he said everything, plain and without elaboration. Take it or leave it. "We did good," she said. "I've been on this ranch 4 years," Tom said. "The cross spread has always been a solid operation. Good cattle, fair wages, decent management." He paused. "But it's been closed, that's the word. Other ranches, even ones that compete for range, there's a neighborly quality, favors exchanged. This one's been closed since the first Mrs. Cross died." He paused again. Gideon pulled in. Made sense, given what he was carrying, but it made things lonelier out here than they had to be. And lonely things get targeted. Evelyn looked at the road. The mountains to the west were dark shapes against a sky that still had a band of pale light at the horizon. "He would have gotten there," she said. "Probably," Tom said. "Eventually." He looked at the horses. "You got him there faster." She didn't say anything to that. She wasn't sure how to receive it without either dismissing it or making too much of it, so she just let it sit between them and watched the road. So Gideon was waiting up. He'd made it to the porch, leg and stick and all, and when the wagon came up the drive, he was standing there in the lamplight that came through the door behind him, and the sight of him standing there in the cold waiting was something she filed away without examining too directly. "How did it go?" he said. "Fletcher's fence is repaired," she said. "The Harlows have a new hay structure framed and half-sided. They'll finish it this week." She climbed the porch steps. "Fletcher wants to talk to you. He'll come out this week if you're up to a visitor." Gideon looked at her. "Fletcher's coming here?" "He said he had things to discuss. I told him you weren't riding yet." A pause. "What kind of things?" "I didn't ask," she said. "I thought that was between you and him." He was still looking at her in that way. The way that was becoming familiar, the less guarded one, the one that saw her rather than the situation she was in. "Come inside," he said. Hattie kept supper. The children were still up, against all reasonable expectation. Charlie because he had an unerring instinct for detecting when something interesting was happening and positioning himself nearby. And Clara because she was Clara and had apparently decided that 9 o'clock was not an unreasonable hour when one was engaged in serious reading. She had the history of the American West open on her lap and looked up when Evelyn came in with the specific expression she used to communicate that she had not been waiting and had simply happened to still be awake. "Did you fix the Harlow fence?" Charlie asked. "Hay structure," Evelyn said. "Yes." "Pete said it was the whole roof. He said the whole roof came in." "The whole roof," she confirmed. "Did the cows get squished?" "Charlie," Claire said, "I'm asking." "The cows were moved before the roof came in," Evelyn said. "Some of them didn't survive the cold, but nothing was squished." Charlie processed this with the seriousness of a child weighing the relative satisfactions of the answers available. "That's sad," he said finally. "About the cold ones." "It is," she said. He looked at her. "But you fixed the new one so the rest of them will be warm." "That's the idea," she said. He nodded, satisfied, and went back to whatever he'd been doing with the length of rope and the orange cat, who had been submitting to his activities with the martyred patience of an animal that had learned the cost of resistance. Clara, when Evelyn sat down near her, said without looking up from her book, "Fletcher's one of the men who is making things difficult." "He was," Evelyn said. "So why did we help him?" Evelyn thought about how to answer this. She could have said something simple, because it was the right thing to do, because neighbors help neighbors. But Clara had the kind of mind that found simple answers unsatisfying when they were being used to avoid harder ones. "Because holding grudges is expensive," she said, "and because the point was never to punish Fletcher. The point was to be able to live in this valley without being at war with it." Clara looked up. "What if he does it again? What if helping him just taught him that there's no cost to being against us?" "That's a real risk," Evelyn said. "I thought about it." She paused. "But I think it's a smaller risk than the alternative, which is that we keep being enemies and spend our energy on that instead of on the ranch. And I think Fletcher is a man who respects things being done plainly. We did something plain. He'll think about it. Clara looked at her for a moment. That measuring look. Her father's look. The one that was cataloging and deciding. You don't know for certain, Clara said. I almost never know for certain, Evelyn said. I work with what's likely. Clara went back to her book. But a moment later, without looking up, I think it'll work. The Fletcher thing. Yeah, Evelyn said. He's not stupid. He knows what it meant that you went there first. 9 years old, Evelyn thought. 9 years old and reading the room better than most adults she'd known. Fletcher came 4 days later when Gideon's leg had improved enough that he could sit in the main room without the stick visible, which mattered to him, and which he had stopped arguing about. The two men talked for 2 hours in the sitting room with the door partly closed, and Evelyn made no attempt to be near enough to hear, because this was the conversation that needed to happen between the two of them without her managing it. When Fletcher left, she was in the kitchen. Gideon came in slowly, without the stick, and lowered himself into a chair with careful dignity. He wants to testify, Gideon said. She turned from the stove. About what? About what he knew of Pemberton's intentions, the water rights, the plan to squeeze out smaller operations once he controlled the North Valley. Gideon looked at the table. He says he didn't know the full scope of it when he participated. I believe him. He's not a man who builds complicated schemes. He followed Pemberton's lead because he'd been doing it for 20 years and hadn't had reason to question it. And now he does, Evelyn said. George Haverford has been talking to the county land commissioner, Gideon said, quietly, through channels. It's possible there'll be a formal inquiry into how certain water rights in this valley were documented and whether the documentation reflects the actual surveys. He paused. If there's an inquiry, Fletcher's testimony would be significant. Pemberton will make things difficult for him, Evelyn said. Fletcher knows that. Gideon looked at her. He said, and I'm quoting him because I want you to hear it exactly. He said that the only people who came to help him after the storm were the people he'd been helping to push out, and that he'd decided he was done making decisions about other people's property from a position of comfort. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. He also said, Gideon continued, that he didn't think you'd brought that timber out to make him feel guilty. He said it made him feel worse that you hadn't. Good, she said softly. Is it? It means he came to the conclusion himself, she said. It'll hold better that way. Gideon looked at her. The afternoon light was coming through the kitchen window at a low winter angle, and the house was warm from the stove, and outside she could hear Pete and Dell doing something in the yard that involved a rope and disagreement. Evelyn, Gideon said. She waited. I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly, not carefully. I'll try, she said. When you came here, he said, when you got off the stage that first day and Tom drove you out and you saw this place for the first time, he paused. Did you think it would be like this? She considered the question honestly. The woman who had stepped off the stage in Harlan Creek with a carpet bag and a practical self-assessment and a determination not to be romantic about any of it. No, she said. I thought it would be harder in the ways I'd prepared for. I didn't expect it to be hard in ways I hadn't prepared for. What ways? The children, she said. Clara and Charlie. I expected to manage. I didn't expect to... She stopped, found the word. Care. I didn't expect to care the way I do. He was very still. And I didn't expect you, she said. She said it the same way she said most things, plainly, without embellishment, because that was how she was, and because he deserved the plain version. I expected someone decent who needed practical help. I got someone decent who is actually interesting to me, who I actually want to talk to. She paused. That wasn't in my plan. The kitchen was quiet except for the stove and the distant argument about the rope. I didn't plan any of this, Gideon said. Any of it. I wrote that letter because Tom told me I needed to and because I knew he was right. And because I was so tired of doing everything alone that I could barely stand up some days. He looked at his hands. I expected someone I could respect, someone the children could rely on. That was the ceiling of what I was hoping for. And, she said, and I don't know what to do with how far past that ceiling we are, he said. I'm not I don't have the vocabulary for it yet. She looked at him. At the face that had been weathered and worked and grieved into something that was not handsome in the way of men who had never been tested but was real in the way of a man who had been tested repeatedly and had not broken. You don't need the vocabulary right now, she said. When do I need it? Later, she said. We have time. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, slow and certain, the way he nodded when something was settled rather than just agreed to. Later, he said. The formal inquiry into Harlan Creek's water rights documentation was opened by the county land commissioner in the third week of November, and by December it had become something larger, a full review of how certain deeds and survey records in the Northern Valley had been filed over the preceding decade. George Haverford, who had been afraid and then less afraid by degrees, cooperated fully. Fletcher gave his testimony. Driscoll, who had his own reasons for wanting Pemberton's arrangements examined, provided documentation he'd been holding quietly since the autumn. Pemberton's response to all of this was to hire a lawyer from Billings and stop speaking to anyone who wasn't on his direct payroll, which was, Evelyn thought, more or less the response of a man who had built his position on other people's ignorance and was discovering that ignorance had been remedied. The formal outcomes would take months. The inquiry had no quick ending, and Gideon's lawyers, he had written to one in Helena, were clear that patience was still required. But the organized pressure on the Cross Ranch stopped, not because Pemberton had been defeated, but because the people he'd been relying on had stopped cooperating. And without cooperation, his reach contracted to his own land. The valley shifted. Not dramatically. Nothing in this valley happened dramatically, unless a storm forced it, but incrementally, in the way that communities shifted when the logic that had governed them stopped making sense. Families that had avoided the crosses started including them in the ordinary social fabric of a ranching community. Margaret Haverford stopped Evelyn on the street in Harlan Creek and talked to her for 20 minutes about nothing in particular, which was its own kind of statement. Two ranchers Evelyn had never met came out to discuss the spring grazing rotation as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Tom noticed it. You know what's different? He said one morning, coming in from the fence check. What? People aren't looking at you like they're waiting for you to do something wrong anymore, he said. She thought about that. What are they looking at me like? Like you live here, he said, and went back out. The children felt the shift too, though they would not have named it as a shift because from their perspective, it was simply the way things had continued to change in the only direction they'd been moving. Charlie had stopped being a small, separate creature orbiting the household and had begun to be, in his small, loud, specific way, something she was responsible for. Not in the abstract sense of a guardian, but in the concrete sense of a person whose daily life intersected with hers at every point, who needed things from her and gave things back without thinking about either, who had decided she was permanent without making an announcement about it. Clara was harder because Clara was always harder, but the changes there were also real, just slower and less visible. She had started saving things for Evelyn. Interesting passages in her books, observations about the horses, a rock she'd found that had a fossil in it, pressed flat and pale in the gray stone, which she put on the kitchen table one morning without explanation and without looking to see if it was received. Evelyn put it on the windowsill above the sink where the light hit it in the afternoon and said nothing. And the next day Clara glanced at it with the smallest possible expression of satisfaction and went back to her breakfast. It was not what Evelyn had expected family to feel like. She had grown up in a family that was functional in the narrow sense. Nothing violent, nothing cruel, just a father who was present and loving and not capable, and the specific loneliness of being the person in a family who held it together without anyone asking if you needed holding together too. She had come out here prepared for more of the same, better dressed. What she had gotten instead was something messier and more actual. A man who talked to her like she was the same as him. Children who argued with her and tested her and occasionally put fossils on her windowsill. A household where the work was hard enough that you couldn't pretend it wasn't, and where surviving it together built something that couldn't be built any other way. She was standing in the kitchen window one December morning, looking at the frost on the ground and the pale sun coming over the eastern ridge, when Gideon came in from the early check and stamped the cold off his boots, and came to stand beside her with his coffee, looking at the same thing. "Hard winter ahead," he said. He said it the way people said things about weather out here. Not as complaint, but as fact, as orientation. Yes, she said. We're better set for it than we were 6 months ago. Yes, she said again. He looked at her instead of the window. Are you all right? She considered the question, not the polite version, the real version. Was she all right in the full sense of what she'd walked into and what it had cost her and what she had now that she hadn't had before? I'm tired, she said. My hands are wrecked. She looked at them. Hands that had done more physical work in 4 months than in the previous 10 years combined, that were calloused in places she didn't know hands could callous. I haven't thought about St. Louis in 2 weeks. I'm not sure if that's good or bad. What do you think? I think it's just true, she said. I think this is where I am now. He was quiet for a moment, then, Evelyn. She turned to look at him. He had the vocabulary now, or enough of it. She could see it in his face, the thing he'd said he didn't have yet, the thing he'd told her they had time for. The words were there, or close enough to there. But what he did instead of using them was something simpler, which was that he took her calloused, work-wrecked hand in his and held it, in the kitchen in the winter light, and that was enough for now because later was still coming and they both knew it. Outside, Charlie's voice arrived from somewhere near the barn, raised in the particular pitch of a child who has made a discovery that the world needs to know about immediately. Clara's voice followed, lower, already explaining something about why the discovery was less surprising than he thought. And under both of their voices, the ranch went on around them. The horses in the corral, the creek below the rise, the mountains white and enormous at the edge of the sky. And it was not perfect, and it was not easy, and there was still Pemberton's lawyers and the long inquiry, and a winter that would demand more than either of them had fully counted on. But she was here. And Gideon's hand was warm around hers, and through the window the frost was burning off in the early sun, going from white to silver to nothing as the light grew. It was enough. For this morning, with everything still ahead of them, it was exactly enough. The winter did what winters in Montana did. It took everything you thought you'd prepared for and added 30% more on top of it, just to see what you were made of. January was brutal in the flat, factual way of real cold, not the dramatic cold of stories, but the grinding kind that settled in and stayed, that made every task take twice as long and cost twice as much energy, and left everyone on the ranch moving through their days with a focused, heads-down persistence that didn't have room in it for anything except the next thing that needed doing. The pipes in the near barn froze twice. The creek iced over at the crossing and had to be broken each morning for the livestock. 2 of the hands got sick within a week of each other, which meant the remaining crew ran short for 10 days while Hattie managed the sick ones, and the rest compensated by doing more than was reasonable. Evelyn did more than was reasonable alongside everyone else, which by now was simply what was expected, not of her specifically, but of anyone who was part of the operation. That was a change she had felt happen without being able to name the exact moment of it. Somewhere between the storm and December and the long, quiet work of winter, she had stopped being the person the ranch was adjusting to and become part of what it adjusted from, the baseline, the given, Caswell said, on a frozen February morning when they were breaking ice together and she made the wrong angle with the bar and had to redo it, other direction, and moved on without the microsecond pause she'd noticed in his early corrections, the pause that had contained his awareness that he was correcting her. Now it was just other direction, like telling Tom or Pete, like telling anyone. She didn't mention this to Gideon. She didn't need to. He saw it too. His leg had healed. Not perfectly. The doctor said there would always be some weakness in that ankle in deep cold, which Gideon received with the neutral acceptance he applied to all information that couldn't be changed. And by February, he was fully mobile and back to the hours that had made him look tired when she first arrived. He was still tired, but differently now. The tiredness of a man carrying a heavy load with help rather than without it. She knew the difference because she'd watched it change. The inquiry into the valley's water rights documentation ground forward through the winter, with the slowness of legal processes conducted across large distances in bad weather. Letters came from the county land commissioner's office, from Gideon's lawyer in Helena, occasionally from George Haverford, with updates on what was being asked and answered. Evelyn read all of it. Gideon brought it to her without being asked, which itself marked a shift from the man who had kept her out of the business side of things for the first weeks. In March, the preliminary findings came back. Gideon read the letter at the kitchen table in the early morning, before the children were up and before Hattie had come down, in the particular quiet of a house that hadn't started its day yet. Evelyn sat across from him with her coffee and waited. He read it twice. Then he put it on the table. The East Tributary water rights were improperly documented, he said. Pemberton's original filing in '81 used a survey that the commissioner's office believes was altered, not the original survey, a copy with the boundary markers moved. She was quiet for a moment. That's serious. It's fraud, Gideon said. The legal word is fraud. She looked at the letter on the table. What does it mean for the ranch? It means the rights revert to their original survey documentation, which puts them clearly within cross-property lines. He paused. It also means Pemberton is going to be dealing with something significantly larger than a valley dispute for the foreseeable future. She looked at him. How do you feel about that? He thought about it honestly. I'm not glad he's ruined, he said. I'm glad it's over. He paused again. There's a difference. I know, she said. I think that difference matters. He looked at her. You would have let him off easier than this if it had been your choice. It wasn't my choice, she said. And no, I would have let the legal process do what it did. What I wouldn't have done is gone after him personally, after his family. She thought about Margaret Haverford, who had sat down for coffee on a Saturday and apologized for doing what she'd been asked to do. About Fletcher, who had come to testify because the only people who'd helped him were the people he'd been working against. There were enough people in this who weren't villains, she said. Just people who followed the wrong lead for too long. That deserves distinguishing. Gideon nodded slowly. The early light was coming through the kitchen window. From upstairs came the sound of Charlie waking up. His particular sequence of sounds, identifiable now as clearly as a signature. I want to tell you something, Gideon said. She waited. When I wrote that first letter, the one to the agency, I was so ashamed of writing it. He looked at the table. I sat with it for 2 months before I sent it. It felt like an admission that I'd failed at something, that I couldn't do this alone, and the proof of it was that I was writing to strangers. I know, she said. You never said it, but I know. The shame is gone, he said. I want you to know that. Whatever it was I thought I was admitting to by writing that letter. I don't feel it anymore. She looked at him. What do you feel instead? Lucky, he said, simple and direct, the way he said the things that cost him something. She opened her mouth and then closed it because Charlie arrived in the kitchen at that moment in his nightshirt with his hair at maximum chaos, announcing that General, the cat, had brought something into the barn that needed immediate adult attention, and the moment folded itself into the ordinary morning and went on. But she carried it. She carried it the way she carried the other things. The fossil on the windowsill, Tom saying you live here. Gideon's hand warm around hers in the December light. Carefully and without making too much of them, because the value of such things was in the having, not the examining. Spring came late and wet and then suddenly warm, the way spring did in Montana. A week of mud, and then a week of green so vivid it looked like an argument. The high pastures opened up, the cattle moved out to the summer range. The ranch expanded back into its full seasonal shape, more people and more activity, and the particular energy of an operation that had come through a hard winter intact and was now moving forward into what it had preserved itself for. The inquiry's formal conclusions were published in April. Pemberton's water rights documentation for 2 tributary filings was declared fraudulent. The rights reverted. There would be civil proceedings. His lawyer from Billings had already filed responses. It would take years to fully resolve, and the Valley understood this. Frontier legal processes did not resolve quickly, but the shape of the power arrangement had shifted in a way that couldn't be shifted back. Pemberton's hold on the North Valley was broken. What he'd built over 20 years through careful manipulation of information and relationships had turned out to rest on the assumption that no one would look too closely. Someone had looked. George Haverford came out to the Cross Ranch in April, which was something that would not have happened 6 months ago. He came formally, with his hat in his hands and the careful manner of a man who knew he was calling on someone he'd wronged and was not sure of his reception. Gideon met him at the porch and brought him inside, and Evelyn made coffee and then excused herself, because this too was something that needed to happen without her managing it. She was in the barn when Gideon found her an hour later. He's offered to resign from the land office, Gideon said. She looked up from the harness she'd been conditioning, the same work she'd been doing when Clara had come to her in the fall, and she was aware of that continuity in the way you were aware of it when it was telling you something. What did you tell him? I told him that wasn't my decision to make, Gideon said, that what he did with his position going forward was between him and his conscience and the commissioner's office. He paused. I also told him that what he'd done, giving the documents, had made a difference, and that I thought it had taken courage, and that I wasn't inclined to punish courage. Good, she said. He asked about you, Gideon said. She looked at him. He wanted to know if you were... His word was settled. If you'd settled in. Gideon had a slight quality to his face that she recognized as the thing that appeared when he found something funny but was containing it. I told him that settled wasn't the right word for you, that you were more present. He seemed to think that was a better answer. She went back to the harness. It is a better answer. I know, Gideon said. I've been paying attention. It was Clara who surprised her most, in the end. Not because the change was sudden, nothing about Clara was sudden, but because when it arrived fully, without the hedging or the testing that had characterized every previous step. It happened on an evening in May, ordinary in all its externals. Supper done. Hattie finished for the night, Charlie in bed after a prolonged negotiation about the orange cat sleeping arrangements that had ended, as these things usually did, in compromise and mild cat resentment. Gideon was at the table with accounts. Evelyn was reading by the lamp. Clara came downstairs with her book and sat across from her, not beside her father. Across from Evelyn. She opened her book and read. After about 20 minutes, she said without looking up, I'm going to tell you something, and I don't want you to make a big thing of it. Evelyn set her own book down. All right. Clara still didn't look up. I'm glad you're here, she said. The words were flat and deliberate, the way Clara said things she'd been thinking about for a long time. I didn't want you here. At first, I thought if I made it hard enough you'd leave, and then it would just be us again. And even though that was bad, it was the bad I knew. She turned a page she hadn't been reading. But you didn't leave, and you didn't try to be something you weren't. And She stopped. I'm glad. That's all. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. The lamp between them was steady, and from the table she could hear the soft scratch of Gideon's pencil, and she knew he could hear every word of this and was keeping very still. Thank you for telling me, she said. She kept her voice even. Clara finally looked up. Her face had the open quality it almost never showed, the unguarded version, the one Evelyn had seen in the barn in the fall and twice since, the face under the face. My mother would have liked you, Clara said. I've thought about it. I think she would have. This was the most Clara had ever offered, and it cost her something, visibly. A slight working in her jaw, the effort of a child keeping hold of herself. I would have liked her, Evelyn said. From everything I know of her through you and your father and this house she built, I would have. Clara nodded once. Then she went back to her book. Evelyn went back to hers, but the page in front of her was just marks for a while, not words, and she let it be marks and sat with the weight of what had just happened without doing anything with it. At the table, she heard Gideon put his pencil down. Then pick it back up. He didn't look over. He didn't need to. The summer that followed was the best the Cross Ranch had seen in years. By the practical measurements available, cattle prices held, the range was good, the water ran clean from the east tributary now uncontested, and the labor-sharing arrangement with the Harlows had turned out to be one of the most useful things the ranch had added in recent memory. Daniel Harlow built them a better equipment shed than they'd had, solid and weatherproof in a way that Sutter, who was not a man to praise other men's craftsmanship easily, acknowledged was good work. Ruth Harlow taught Evelyn things about preserving and cold storage that extended the ranch's food independence through the following winter. They ate together 4 or 5 times over the summer, the easy casualness of families who have decided they like each other. Fletcher's operation and the Cross Ranch settled into a functional neighborliness that was not warm exactly, but was reliable, which was worth more than warmth on a frontier where what you needed from your neighbors was to be able to count on them. He came to the fence line disputes with practical proposals. He shared weather information. He showed up once to help with a difficult calving without being asked, worked for 3 hours, said little, and left. Gideon told Evelyn afterward that this was, for Fletcher, an extravagant gesture. Margaret Haverford became something she hadn't expected. A friend, tentative and slightly formal in the way of two women who had met under adversarial circumstances, but genuine. They met for coffee in Harlan Creek on Saturdays when the roads were good, and talked about books and land policy and the specific difficulties of being a capable woman in a place that didn't quite have a category for you yet. Margaret had started teaching again, was a few children whose families couldn't get them to the schoolhouse regularly, nothing official, just afternoons in her kitchen. It suited her. Evelyn thought it was probably the first thing she'd done in 10 years that was entirely her own. The town's adjustment to Evelyn was not complete and would not be. There were families who remained cool, people who had made early judgments and found it easier to maintain them than revise. She did not need everyone. She had stopped needing everyone somewhere around October of the previous year, about the time Caswell had said other direction without the pause. What she needed was enough, and enough was achievable. She had learned this year to distinguish between the two. What she hadn't learned, hadn't expected to need to learn, was what to do when the life she'd built began to feel like it had always been hers, when she stopped noticing the strangeness of it and started just living it. That transition had no clear border. It happened the way sleep happened. At some point you were in it without knowing the exact moment you crossed from one state to another. She thought about this on a morning in late August when she was riding the north fence line alone. She rode alone regularly now, which would have been inconceivable in October, and came to the high pasture where the storm had caught them the previous November. The fence was solid. The creek, visible in the valley below, ran low and clear in the late summer. The mountains stood exactly as they always stood, enormous and patient in a way that made human timelines feel modest. She thought about the woman who had stepped off the stage in Harlan Creek 11 months ago. Practical, defensive, determined not to be romantic about anything. A woman who had written a letter to a stranger because she was out of options and was smart enough to know it, and who had been ashamed of that right up until the moment she wasn't. She had been wrong about what the shame meant. She had thought it meant weakness, admitting she needed something she couldn't provide for herself. What it had actually been was honesty. One honest letter to one honest man, and the 11 months that had come from it, and the life that had come from those months. People told themselves stories about how strength worked, that it was solitary, that needing anyone was a liability, that the self-sufficient person was the safe person. She had told herself that story for years, and it had kept her upright and alone and very, very tired. What she knew now was that strength was more interesting than that. It was not the absence of need. It was the willingness to bring what you had into proximity with what someone else had and see what the two of them could build that neither could build alone. Gideon couldn't see what she could see. She couldn't do what he could do. Together they could see everything and do most things, and what they couldn't do they could ask Tom or Caswell or Sutter or Daniel Harlow or Margaret Haverford. The network of it, the actual human network of people who were reliable to each other, was what held things together when the storms came. Not any one person's sufficiency. The web between them. Biscuit shifted under her, impatient with the stillness. "All right," Evelyn said, and they started back down. The question of what to call her came from Charlie, as most of the direct questions in the Cross household did, on a Sunday in September, a year and a few weeks after she'd arrived. He had been talking to a boy from a neighboring family who had visited with his parents, and something about the conversation had apparently lodged in him. And he arrived in the kitchen that evening while she was helping Hattie with supper and said, without preamble, "Henry says his mother. When he's talking about her, he says my mother. Can I say that about you?" Hattie, with great professionalism, became extremely interested in what she was doing on the other side of the kitchen. Evelyn put down what she was holding. She crouched so she was at Charlie's level, which still required some bending because he'd grown since spring. "Do you want to?" she said. He thought about it with the gravity of a 7-year-old for whom the question had clearly been enormous all day. "Yes," he said. "I think so. I know you're not. I know it's different, but I want there to be a word." "Then yes," she said. "You can say that." He looked at her with those eyes that had been solemn over a stunned sparrow on a porch more than a year ago. "Okay," he said, satisfied in the complete way of someone who had resolved something. Then he went to find the orange cat, who was his most pressing concern for the remainder of the evening. Evelyn stood up. Hattie still had her back to her. "Don't," Evelyn said. "I'm not doing anything," Hattie said. "You were about to." A pause. "Maybe," Hattie said, "and nothing else." And that was as close as Hattie Bowes would ever come to sentiment, and it was enough. Clara's version came 3 weeks later and was entirely Clara. No preamble, no ceremony. A Tuesday afternoon when Evelyn was doing accounts at the kitchen table and Clara needed help with a Latin passage from a new book she'd gotten. She came in, put the book on the table and said, "Mama, this one doesn't make sense." And then she sat down and pointed at the line and waited for help. She didn't look up. She didn't acknowledge what she'd said. She just waited for the Latin. Evelyn looked at the passage. Her eyes took a moment to focus on it. "The construction here is ablative absolute," she said. "It means the action in this clause is separate from the main sentence." "Oh," Clara said, "that's why it felt wrong." "That's why it felt wrong," Evelyn agreed. They worked through the passage together. Clara asked 3 more questions, got 3 more answers, said thank you, and took the book back upstairs. Evelyn sat at the table for a while after. 11 months ago, she had stepped off a stage into a town that didn't want her, toward a life she'd constructed out of practical necessity and one honest letter and the specific courage of a person who has run out of less frightening options. She had not been brave in the storybook sense. She had been scared and stubborn, and occasionally wrong, and always tired. She had made mistakes she'd cataloged and corrected and made different ones afterward. She had not transformed this family through the force of her goodness. She had simply shown up every morning and done the next thing, and been honest about what she didn't know, and stayed. Staying was not a small thing. She was more certain of that than almost anything else she'd arrived at this year. It was the hardest thing she'd done, on the days when it was hard. Harder than the creek crossing, harder than the conversation with Fletcher, harder than the long winter work. The creek crossing had been one terrible hour. Staying was every day, including the days when nothing happened to make staying feel meaningful, when it was just the fire in the stove, the ice on the water trough, the harness that needed work, the accounts that needed checking, the child who needed Latin help and would not say so directly. Most of life was those days. The ordinary ones, strung together without drama. What you were was determined not by how you performed in the crisis. Anyone could be useful in a crisis. Crisis clarified everything. But by who you were in the long, undramatic middle of things, when no one was watching and there was nothing to prove and the only witness was yourself. She had learned that out here. From a land that didn't care what you thought of yourself, only what you did. She heard Gideon's boots on the porch, the familiar sequence of him, the weight of him, the particular sound of a man who moved through space with complete practical awareness, no wasted motion. He came through the door and saw her at the table and stopped. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," she said. He looked at her. 11 months of looking at each other had refined the communication between them into something more efficient than words, and he could read her better than she was always comfortable with. "Clara Sam," he said. "Clara eat," she confirmed. He crossed the kitchen and sat down across from her in the chair Charlie had occupied for the sparrow conversation and the caterpillar conversation, and a dozen other conversations that had built themselves into the architecture of what this place was now. "She called me Mama," Evelyn said, casually, like it was already the word. Gideon was quiet. "It's the most Clara thing she could have done," Evelyn said. "Just deploy the word and move on." "That's her mother's daughter," Gideon said. He said it simply, without pain, which was its own kind of progress. The way grief moved over time, from wound to fact, from fact to part of the story. She decided something and acted on it. She did. Evelyn looked at her hands on the table. "I didn't expect to feel this much about this life," she said. "I keep being surprised by how much I feel." "Is that bad?" "No," she said. "It's just not what I planned." Gideon looked at her with everything that had accumulated between them this year in his face. Not just the feeling of it, but the history, the storm, and the kitchen, and the surveys, and the frost burning off the grass, and 2 children who had decided, each in their own way, that she was permanent. "Plans are useful for getting started," he said. "Then you put them down and work with what's actually in front of you." "Is that frontier wisdom?" she said. "That's just sense," he said. She looked at him. This man she had written a letter to because she was honest enough to admit what she needed. This family she had built with him out of a practical arrangement and a year of choosing every day to stay and do the next thing. Outside, the September evening was settling over the ranch in long golden light, and somewhere near the barn, Charlie was having an animated one-sided conversation with the orange cat, and the mountains were exactly as they always were, and the creek ran over its rocks with the sound that had become, without her noticing, the sound of home. She had come to this place with a trunk and a carpet bag, and one honest letter, and the kind of courage that doesn't look like courage from the inside. Just stubbornness, just not knowing what else to do. She had found, on the other side of the fear and the work and the year of staying, that it had been enough. Not more than enough. Not a triumph, just enough. Which turned out to be the only thing any life needed to be.